Okay, I think we're live. Good morning, everyone, both my friends on the screen and also to everyone who's participating online. It's Saturday, May 6th, 2023. We have another edition of the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation. And today we're going to first pay tribute to the great Harry Belafonte, who recently passed at the end of April. And we have a video as well, and we'll spend time discussing his life and what he means for us in the world. And then we will go on back to continuing our reading of Hegel's Science of Logic. But to pay tribute to Harry Belafonte, I wanted to pass it to Serafina, who will lead our discussion and tribute.
Thanks, Emily. I'm glad that we're also talking and celebrating the life of Harry Belafonte, because there's a lot of, networks on the news that celebrated his life, but did not get to his revolutionary essence of his life and why he's important. He's not solely a singer or cultural figure because he was able to sing well, but his commitment to the struggle for Black people, for the people of the world, for peace and democracy. So I wanted to say that the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King was a revolution to ultimately change America for democracy by the American people. Some people were killed young, like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X was shot at 39, Medgar Evers at 37. Bobby Kennedy was president in his late 30s.
Was running for president.
Running for president? Yeah. No problem. And was shot at 42. And while his brother John Kennedy was shot when he was 46. And these were people who were involved in the revolution that happened in this country, in the civil rights movement. And these are the lives of people who were gone too soon and with the need that had the need to transform this nation into a place where all human beings were free and lived in a true democracy. And we're lucky to have the younger generation following Harry Belafonte, like Lorraine Hansberry and Baldwin, to pass on the memory of Du Bois, Paul Robeson, and even Harry Belafonte. But they too, and in turn, were older than the generation to come, like Julian Bond of SNCC, Jerome Smith of CORE, Anthony Montero, and Angela Davis, who will also become to be the voice of my generation, struggling for the same cause of democracy and peace. And those who survived the revolutionary period of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, like Harry Belafonte, who didn't give in or die spiritually or physically, continued the struggle for peace and democracy on this planet. And with that, we owe them the deepest gratitude for their commitment to truth and democracy. And this is the life that was led by Harry Belafonte. It was not because he was solely a singer, but his commitment for the revolutionary freeing of Black and white men in America, and thus his commitment to peace, to take responsibility for all of us, his people, the future to him, and the now to us who speak of his life, to live in a world where we can be human beings and have our needs met spiritually and physically. I want to also highlight that his commitment to the struggle for revolutionary change in this country was dependent on Paul Robeson and W.B. Du Bois. He always owes or get thanks back to both of them as mentors and leaders of his own thinking and practice in life. He, in a lot of ways, worked alongside Paul Robeson, saw him. Paul Robeson was a cultural figure that was prominent while he was growing up. So everything that he could have done was because of Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson opened the door not only to actors, but for art, to stand for revolutionary, to attain the revolutionary potential for freedom, for all, like to struggle against colonialism, and so on. And Harry Belafonte was able to struggle because of him, because of Paul Robeson. I wanted to talk a little bit about like Harry Belafonte's life, but I think we can discuss that more so as we are gonna watch a video where we can hear his words, which I also think is important. His life is something of his, because his arc of his life was up to like 96 years. His whole commitment in his life was a struggle for freedom. He at first was attracted to like the folk art, and he found reason to know his people, based off of like the working people of Jamaica and the protest songs because of Paul Robeson. And like even like the Banana song is still a work song, which he he'll talk about it or not. But with that and the universality that he learned as the lens to look at his own people, he was able to use the entire world and the world's cultures as his canvas, to draw from, because all of humanity is connected to the struggle for freedom with work. This humanity is what he connected to. I think I want to get into some of the details, but I am to say like he was a high school dropout.
Yeah, he didn't graduate from high school.
He didn't graduate from high school, and then he went into World War II in the U.S. Navy. And he was participated in the war as in the segregated, I don't know, grouping, unit. Yeah, the unit of the army.
The whole armed forces was segregated.
Right.
And the Navy was the most segregated.
And that's how he also understood like he knew that the struggle was for democracy after he fought in the war. Because after the war, the Negroes, the Black soldiers were assuming that they would be better treated because they fought for this country, but they weren't. And he came back to Harlem where he was raised, and he was like working in an apartment or some type of complex where he was just a janitor. And so one day when he was able to, and this was like, I guess he was still like 18 or 19, and he was working, and as a tip, somebody gave him tickets to see a play at the All-American or the American Negro Theater in Harlem. And immediately when he, saw the play, he felt attracted to the theater and the power of the theater. He wanted to wield it. And I think at one point, the American Negro Theater were putting on a Sean O'Casey play, which was the Irish playwright, and it was about the Irish rebellion against the British. And he had a role in it, and I think it was like either in the first week of the showing or the week or the 1 week Paul Robeson had come to see the play being performed by American Black people, and that was the first time that he actually met Paul Robeson. But prior to that, Paul Robeson was just a large figure in the lives of all American people, on stage and whatnot. So when Paul Robeson had met the young kids at the time, with Harry Belafonte included, who were playing in the Sean O'Casey play, Paul Robeson had given them words of advice. And that was also a crucial moment for Harry Belafonte, where he knew that he could use his art for his people, and that plays like the struggle against the British and revolutionary art is for the people and things like that. But he was also dyslexic, which is why he had troubles in school. But I think one of the first people he were to read were Du Bois is, and I forget which one it was. I know he mentioned that one of the first people he read was Du Bois. But those are the main highlights that I have from kind of watching his videos all week and us talking about Harry Belafonte. But if you want to move on to the video, because I think his words would be important for us to hear, we can do so. Is the sound on?
Sound and
There we go. Ugh, I missed the important part. Yeah, we'll get to it.
Okay, so there's no sound for the photos, but there will be sound with the interviews when he talks. And a lot of the interviews, the main interview that's shown is a video that people from the free school have shared a lot. And it's because Sade's YouTube algorithm suggested it to her. And I found that one, it was from 10 years ago from a Washington, D.C. Conference or some sort of assembly where he was being given a Here I Stand award. And then there's a video that Jeremiah showed me of him in 1959 performing with some folk singers.
In that struggle. So Africans were conscripted into the European expeditionary forces to not only fight in Africa, but to fight all throughout Europe and to fight in Asia. And the expectations among Africans and Asians who were oppressed were exactly the same as the expectations among young black men and women in America about what was to be at the end of this journey. When the war ended and fascism was defeated, we returned, all of us, globally, with great expectations about the rewards that would be availed to us. However, there was no such generosity. Nothing could have been further from the truth. In America, America hastened to escalate white oppression. They began, first of all, by demonstrating that they were prepared to go to any extreme to contain us and to let us know that how we had been indoctrinated by the concepts of fighting for democracy, that it did not apply to us. And they began to systematically murder black men and black women. They began to punish us as a people for daring to think that we could be afforded democracy. And so in this climate, what happened to us was a great sense of rebellion. We had been made warriors. We had come to know the instructions of violence, and we were prepared to stand strong and to confront the enemies in America as we perceived them, and as they, in fact, were. It was to our great, great benefit. It was to our great reward that we should have had in our midst men like Paul Robeson, men like Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, ultimately other men and women who emerged to give us instruction, to give us the value of profound thought, to give us incisive political analysis, to help guide our energies from an act of violence to a place of strategy, to a place of cunning, and set the stage for what was to be the rest of the 20th century. So while we were here in America, grappling with the earliest days of our own freedom and our rights in this nation, we were paralleled by millions of Africans who had the same thought, who had the same expectations, who were cruelly returned to the oppression of colonialism, and who also had the sense of rebellion. So here was Africa in a new kind of resistance, in a new kind of upheaval. Kenya, Ghana, Guinea, all the nations of Africa were in rebellion against colonialism, against the French, against the British, against the Dutch. And in Asia, the Asian people had risen up against colonialism. After all, they had fought the fascism that came from Japan. Their expectations were the same as ours. And Vietnam and all the others became part of a global liberation struggle. And there were those who would deny us this association, this sense of global commonality. And if it had not been for Paul Robeson, had it not been for Dr. Du Bois and others who gave us keen instruction, who put their lives on the line, who stood strong in the midst of tremendous opposition, we would not have been the beneficiaries of what turned out to be the guiding factors of our life. And others who rose up not too long thereafter, Malcolm X, Dr. King, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, on and on and on. All those people were the benefactors of this stunning moment in human history. And in that journey, I dare say that I found my center as a human being. I found my center and I found my purpose for how I was to use my life. And the greatest example for me was, in fact, the man who chose to mentor me, who found me very early in life and began to give me instruction. It made me feel a part of the world in which he lived. And by his intellect and his strength and his courage, set my course. And that was Paul Robeson. I was a high school dropout. And that's not an uncommon story in our communities. But I was instilled with a sense of loss when I did not get a degree, and I had not been able to find a way in which to articulate feelings and thoughts and ideas. When I came out of the Second World War, the best of my skills was to be a handyman. I worked as a janitor's assistant in a building. I took care of the garbage. I took care of the latrine. I took care of mopping the halls. I took care of repairing things that needed repairing in the apartments of the tenants of the building. And on one such occasion, as a gratuity, I was given a tip, 2 tickets to a community theater in Harlem in New York called the American Negro Theater, a little place that sat in the basement of the Harlem Library on 135th Street. And when I walked into this place, I could sense there was a reverence about it. After all, I think there were no more than about 30 seats or 40 seats. It wasn't a very big audience. It wasn't a very big theater. But it was our theater. Yeah. And our voices were to be heard. And when I sat, it had not been quite like my other experiences, because I'd always found that when you got more than 3 black people in the room, there was going to be some kind of noise. Yeah. But in this instance, there was a silence that suggested some kind of, that we were in some place that was quite sanctified, that there were expectations. And when the lights dim and the curtains open, that expectation was revealed to me. I saw black men and women standing on a stage. I saw them digging into the poetry of black voice. And I saw them articulate a sense of hope and future and purpose. The play was called Home is the Hunter. It was a story about a black soldier returning to America from the Second World War. And I sat riveted throughout that evening, and I knew that I'd come upon a place and a moment where my life would forever be changed. I begged to be a part of that group. I asked to be permitted to stay, to do anything, just to be in the environment, to hear, to be touched by the purpose that these young men and women were immersed in. And as a handyman working, I eventually wound my way into being part of the classes, to listen to the lectures. And one night, we had decided, the group did, to do a play called Juno and the Paycock, written by an Irish playwright by the name of Sean O'Casey, to be done by this black cast. And this Irish play was about the Irish resistance to British domination. And we from the Caribbean and in our black community in Harlem felt very much in sympathy with the contents of that play. And so we performed it with great relish. And on the second night of our performance, in came a man to visit us. His name was Paul Robeson. And we were quite stunned by the fact that in our humble environment, this great giant should have decided to come visit. And at the end of the play, he stayed. And what we thought would have been a polite protocol visit stretched into a 2-hour evening with Paul Robeson, with him imparting his sense of culture and theater and the power of the arts. And he also was very friendly, as he was with many around the world who are men of letters, who are committed to social and human growth and development and resistance to oppression. That was Sean O'Casey. Sean O'Casey was a friend of his. He had to see the play because he wanted to go back and tell his Irish friend, our black people are doing your play. Your voice has reached a new horizon. And from that moment on, I not only sought out Paul Robeson everywhere he was, but I became deeply immersed in his thoughts, his ideas, and his political commitment to the liberation of the peoples of the world, and in particular, peoples of African descent. It was he who taught me and showed me that the power of the art was perhaps the most powerful force on the face of the earth. After all, it was indeed the arts that held the black family together. It was culture. It was our ability through art and through the voice of artistic expression that we had handed down our history from one to the other. It was in our music and in our songs in which we had language that talked about our liberation and our joy and our expectations in life. It was in our songs that we codified our message for resistance to oppression. It was in our songs we developed our sense of rebellion against slave masters. It was in our exchanges and our oral history that we understood who we were as a people and were able to develop our resistance to oppression and ultimately our liberation. Without art, without culture, we would hardly have been able to overcome and do as much as we did. And when you connect that to Africa and the art of Africa, the songs of Africa, the history of Africa, all of it begins to unfold itself as the richest place in which we could be. Although this society of ours aspires to many other objectives and goals, it is not without calculation and without villainy that I suspect that art is so suppressed and oppressed in our country as we are now experiencing it. The culture in which we find ourselves in America is not a culture that inspires. It is not a culture that instructs. It is not a culture that opens up the human heart to human experience. It is not a culture that suggests to us that in difference there is beauty, not fear. That in difference, our future, our moral center resides. In difference, our humanity exists. Unless we know the African, unless we know the Asian, unless we know all the peoples of this planet and their beauty and their strength, we will never be able to extricate ourselves from our own oppression. And it is in this mission that I was blessed to find myself. And here I was without the ability to read, because I was a dropout with not great marks. But I was inspired by what Robeson showed me, what the theater said, what black people were saying. And you know who was in that theater with me? When I walked into that theater, there was Ossie Davis, there was Ruby Dee, and there was a man with whom I would share, a young rascal. As a matter of fact, he was older than I was. But in those days, we were all young. I was 19. So was he. We both come out of the service. Sidney Poitier.
Yeah.
And having made my choice to select from that palette what I would do, Paul Robeson once said to me, he said, Harry, get them to sing your song, meaning the world, people. Get them to sing your song, and they will want to know who you are. And if they want to know who you are, you have now been given the first opportunity to give them instruction that might illuminate and give them some choices that they may never have had before.
Stars begin to fall. When the stars begin to fall. My Lord, what a morning. My Lord, what a morning. Oh, my Lord, what a morning. When the stars begin to fall. When the stars begin to fall. On my way to the promised land, I heard from heaven today. God's gonna give me his right hand. I heard from heaven today. Oh, my Lord, what a morning. My Lord, what a morning. Oh, my Lord, what a morning. When the stars begin to fall. When the stars begin to
Yeah, there's a lot of see, that was only 7 I was actually scared that it was too long of a video show, and honestly, I feel like we could watch, like, 2 hours of him speaking and performing, and it would feel like 20 minutes. There's so many interviews, like, it's a whole treasure trove of materials because he's done countless interviews since the beginning of his career, and then especially at the end of his life, he never stopped speaking out.
No,
And I wish that I had given myself more time to really just like go through everything. Like there's this feeling of there's so much of him, and intellectually, spiritually, and just in the way he is, that I wish I could have taken more from to capture in more totality. But the reason why I especially liked the first video, the one that Shade had found, was because I felt like he like, it's hard to even, like it's hard to even describe because he says it so perfectly, but I really liked the way I was really stunned and moved by the depth of Harry Belafonte's intellect
Hmm.
and him politically, ideologically, morally, like, how complete of a person he is. And he kinda says it a lot, like, there's also like I said, there's so many interviews, but he says it in a different interview where he's being interviewed on the blues and jazz, where he says, "You know, I never really." He was describing his life where he was like, "Honestly, when I started out, like, acting and performing, I never really thought about it in terms of acting or performing." And he talked about being an artist. He was like, "My whole life, I never thought I was, like, that smart. I just knew that I wanted to contribute to my people." And he was like, more than art being my starting point, wanting to contribute to my people was my starting point, and that is what guided my artistic career. And I feel like you get that sense from even the way he talks, where he always starts from the standpoint of, let me tell you who is my grounding. Like, let me tell you about the history that grounds why I do what I do and why I continue to speak out. And that's why he references Du Bois and he references Robeson. Um, but the thing that I think I really, there's a lot to take out of it, but I guess the one thing I just wanted to say was the thing that really moved me too is how much he focused on how important Robeson and Du Bois were to give him instruction. And because he talks a lot about how he was like, I sometimes feel bad that I didn't graduate from high school because I had all these feelings, but I didn't have a language or framework yet to describe it. And he was like, Robeson and Du Bois gave me that. It's kind of like they gave me and like everyone else in that time period instruction of not just how to like see ourselves as human beings with dignity and a contribution to make and a purpose to live by, but it also gave us a place in the world, and it gave us like an access point to be one with world humanity. And I think like Sade had also mentioned this in the text, but I also love the sense of like how for him history, like that historic moment is also so important, and what that does to both love yourself, but then how it gives you the ability to love other people and see the beauty in humanity, and to do exactly the opposite of what, like, even Harry Belafonte said the ruling class does not want you to do, which is to see a stranger and immediately want to understand them and love them. And he says that he's like, that is why art is suppressed, and you can tell that's this Robeson's influence, where Harry Belafonte perfectly inherits Robeson, and he tries to keep it and express it for the younger generations because you can tell Harry Belafonte really sees himself in the youth, where he's like, I was a college dropout, like that's not uncommon. Like I did not know myself. I wasn't even sure. I was blessed to meet Paul Robeson. I was blessed to live in the historic moment I did. And let me try to pass that on to you. And he makes that point about art where he says art and culture is by far the superior, most powerful tool to pass on history, but also pass on instruction of how to live. And the way he says, and that's why the ruling class has, in order to both destroy our people, but destroy the people, the way they do it is to try to destroy art and culture that teaches us how to like see ourselves and thus go beyond ourselves, to be one with people who are different than us, and to love and to choose love and to choose to understand rather than to fear. Um, but Yeah, it's just, and also that, I think I already said this, but I guess to say it again, this thing of how Harry Belafonte, like, he's so humble, and you can tell for him, he almost looks at his own life as a miracle where he's like, "I'm not special, like, this could have been anyone," where he's like, "Oh, this could have been anyone," which is why I feel so in debt to, like, give, and speak and try to teach, where he says, like, "Teach through my life," where he says, like, "I found myself," like, Robeson and Du Bois taught me how I could find myself in the great struggle of humanity's great struggle for freedom. How he was like, "I found myself in that." Like, that's how I found myself, and I'm blessed to have been able to do that. But I'll stop there.
Go ahead.
Um, just to add on to what Emily was saying, I think what really stood out is when Belafonte said that dropping out of high school or not having education, he felt such a great sense of loss. And the word loss really stood out to me too, because I think that's also a problem that we face in our generation, where so many young children and even adults are left out from a true education. Um, but in some ways, I think similar to what Emily was saying about instruction, he found an education through
Yeah.
Robeson and Du Bois, and an education that helped him to see also larger humanity. Because a lot of what he's saying about how learning about Africa, learning about Asia, that gave him the tool also to understand Afro America and America, and a way to also resist. And it's very apparent through Robeson and Belafonte as well how art and music are not like removed from the people in the ways that it is now. Because he was saying like art and music as history, as a tool against oppression.
Mhm.
It also reminded me a lot of like something we've talked about in the past, which is Jacob Lawrence. Because of something Jacob Lawrence says is that he doesn't really see himself just as a painter. Instead, he sees himself as a historian. The way he paints, like the Great Migration series of Black people moving from the South to the North. And even the library, the Harlem Library that Belafonte references, that's currently the Schomburg, still in Harlem on 135th Street. The same library. Emily and I were looking at each other because we remembered how Baldwin, that was also a critical library for him.
And Jacob Lawrence.
And Jacob
Yeah.
Lawrence, where they would go there to learn everything. They would read, like Baldwin talked about how he read everything. And it was also his way of educating himself about his people and about the world. And yeah, and it's like I haven't really like listened to Belafonte, and it's also really weird because Shambartu was saying yesterday how in India, like Belafonte is huge, but there's also a layer where you don't really, or what Serafino was saying before, some people know Belafonte, but removed from his political struggle. And it was odd because when Shambarta said that, I was like, I grew up in the US and I actually never heard about Belafonte prior to the free school. And that's why I'm really grateful that Emily had like put this together, even in the short clips, and people have been sharing so much about Belafonte in these weeks, because he's just such a beautiful man, but also beautiful because I mean, both like in terms of his talent and person, but also how he is truly connected in the ways that Robeson is to humanity, like to people.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about Belafonte. Like, I think in this room I'm in, there's a lot of feeling about Belafonte. And one, I want to say without Belafonte, Kennedy would not be connected to King.
Yeah.
Because it was Bobby Kennedy who originally had gone to Harry Belafonte after Jackie Robinson had sponsored the Republican Party. that and looking for advice to connect to Black people for his run. And in that conversation Belafonte had with Kennedy, it was kind of like he was seeing what Bobby knew about Black people and was like, well, damn, I don't think he knows anything about what's going on in the civil rights movement that was emerging in the South, that Harry Belafonte was already there. Like he in a lot of ways, Emily, like it was the fact that his life was a blessing. But even I see him as being like this kind of accidental positioning of like with everything that is emerging around him and also what was already born that he was born into. He was like the connecting piece to King from Paul Robeson and Du Bois. And I say that also, in consideration of the anti-colonial struggle that he also mentioned in Africa and Asia. I say that because of the world peace movement and the communist movement that we've studied with Bandung, with Henry Winston. And I say that also because in some ways, though Belafonte wasn't in a particular party, he had everything to do with the world peace movement, because of what he was always speaking in and involved in. So when Bobby Kennedy had met with Harry Belafonte had responded to Bobby Kennedy. He was like, well, Black people aren't going to take just a celebrity ticket just for you to get a good edgewise, a good word in for Black people and things like that. You have to go to King because King is the actual leader. King is the central to the movement. And his relationship with the civil rights movement is essentially also what you had mentioned, Emily. That's the thing, the center. The fact, the life purpose that he found, his center, he also was able to hold that center for the rest of people who were struggling in the civil rights movement, like King, SNCC, and so on, which I think is really deep because he also became he emerged to be somebody who King relied upon for advice. He would mention times when King would go to his or Belafonte's apartment to rest and write out ideas and things like that. But I think there's also a lot of feeling in this room because that he was a torchbearer in the struggle, and that was the essential motivation for him as a human being who was struggling for our people. And I think us learning about Belafonte, because his name to me is always there, he's always just there. He had a conversation later when the civil rights movement was developing. I forget which year it was. Somebody else can fill in that information. Where James Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry, Belafonte, Lena Horne, Jerome Smith,
1963.
1963.
Yeah.
Where they met
right before the March on Washington.
Right. Where they met with Bobby Kennedy again to talk about the kind of developing situation in the South, where actually Kennedy has to put his life on the line for Black people, to stand with Black people. And Harry Belafonte was there in the meeting. He didn't have a central thing that he said that was ultimately profound. His fact that he was committed to the struggle, the fact that he has been this entire time, led him to being reliable upon to be asked to even be at the meeting with the people who spoke to Bobby Kennedy. And to give Kennedy a perspective, again, once more, about where the civil rights is going and it should go. He was there in a variety of interviews that also included James Baldwin. And I was looking for writings. I can continue to look for writings if he did any on Belafonte in particular. But in the perspective of Baldwin, I thought was also interesting because of how he respected Belafonte as a good man. Like he was, consistent. And yeah, I just feel like Belafonte is a torchbearer, and he was able to pass on because he took responsibility at his time and continued to do in his entire life. And I think he's also able to pass on to us in a lot of ways. So
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what people are saying. I actually was thinking about it, and the first time I remember ever encountering Harry Belafonte's name was in a Baldwin essay, which some of us read while we were in college, which is called Unnameable Objects, Unspeakable Crimes.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And there's a part where Baldwin talks about like him joining the movement in Montgomery. And then he talks about being next to Belafonte. Is it okay if you just read part of that passage? Okay, I won't read the whole thing, but yeah, this is from Baldwin's essay, Unnameable Objects, Unspeakable Crimes. But he says, and this is him, Baldwin, talking about being in Montgomery, where he says, "We reached the white section of town. There the businessmen stood on balconies jeering. There stood their maids in back doors, silent, not daring to wave, but nodding. I watched a black, or rather, a beige-colored woman standing in the street watching us thoughtfully. She looked as though she probably held a clerical job in one of those buildings, proof, no doubt, to the jeering white businessmen that the South was making progress. This woman decided to join us for when we reached the Capitol. I noticed that she was standing there. But while we were still marching through the white part of town,
Excuse me. I'm sorry.
while we were still marching through the white part of town, the watching, the waiting, the frightened part of town, we lifted our small American flags and we faced those eyes, which could not face ours, and we sang. I was next to Harry Belafonte. From upstairs office windows, white American secretaries were leaning out of windows, jeering and mocking, and using the ancient Roman sentence of death, thumbs down. Then they saw Harry, who is my very dear friend and a beautiful cat, and who is also, in this most desperately schizophrenic of republics, a reigning matinee idol. One does not need to be a student of Freud to understand what buried forces create a matinee idol, or what he represents to that public which batters down the doors to see him. Parentheses, one need only watch the rise and fall of American politicians. This is a sinister observation, and I mean it very seriously. The secretaries were legally white. It was on that basis that they lived their lives, from this principle that they took collectively their values, which is, as I have tried to indicate, an interesting spiritual condition. But they were also young. In that ghastly town, they were certainly lonely. They could only, after all, look forward to an alliance by and by with one of the jeering businessmen. Their boyfriends could only look forward to becoming one of them. And they were also female, a word which, in the context of the color curtain, has suffered the same fate as the word male. It has become practically obscene. When the girls saw Harry Belafonte, a collision occurred in them so visible as to be at once hilarious and unutterably sad. At one moment, the thumbs were down. They were barricaded within their skins. At the next moment, those downturned thumbs flew to their mouths. Their fingers pointed, their faces changed. And exactly like Bobby Soxers, they oohed and awed and moaned. God knows what was happening in the minds and hearts of those girls. Perhaps they would like to be free.
I remember that part actually. Wow,
Yeah. I don't know what a Bobby Soxer is, but
Yeah, that used to be, Bobby. They were like fans of movie idols and pop music stars.
yeah.
And Bobby socks is a kind of socks I saw Kathy wearing one time.
Oh.
Yeah, it only came up to a little bit above your ankles.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, for some reason I really remembered. I think this essay by Baldwin in particular was something that has stuck in my brain for a long time, and it really shook me because I think, and this has also been part of my reflection with Belafonte's passing, but I think it's times like these where you start to realize, as like a young person growing up in this country, as like a children of immigrants, yada yada yada, that whole thing, where you realize that you kind of stepped into a world, like a side of America, like a history of America that you have not known. Like you step into something that is like so like complex but also beautiful, but like this whole drama of American history which you've never been trained or prepared or taught to see. And I think the one thing that has really impressed me with the past week of um, Belafonte's passing is just seeing how many people, like this outpouring of people who we know in the free school, like all kinds of people, like remembering him. And I think it's very humbling because, yeah, like it makes you feel like suddenly you realize, like, oh, like I'm walking on hallowed ground, like I'm walking in the footsteps of these people. And yeah, like I feel that when I listen to like that song, My Lord, What a Morning, and then also just listening to him. And yeah, the last thing that I've been thinking about is I think Brother Jerome shared an article that talked about how when Belafonte was, you know, after he dropped out of college and was in the Navy, that was when he read Color and Democracy by Du Bois. And that was part of his like his intellectual and ideological shaping. And yeah, like it was like it's very similar, like that's kind of the feeling that I've been having, where I was just struck by like you know, for some of us who've read that, like it has been really important to like our ideological development. But I think you sometimes underestimate, like, oh shit, like I'm part of something much larger than myself, like something that stretches back, like I'm walking again, yeah, like in hollowed ground on the footsteps of these people. And it just gives you a sense of history, but also a sense of like humility too, where you're like, oh damn, like can I ever live up to these people? And it really is like also like I feel like that scene that Baldwin describes, which was like in the heat and like in like the thickness of the civil rights movement. Yeah, like part of what those young white women were responding to was the kind of man that Belafonte was.
Yeah.
And that essence of him describing Robeson, telling him like get them to sing your song. And I think that's something which is can never, it's hard to capture in kind of the stereotypical like leftist terms that many people use, but like that is part of the essence of yeah, this American experiment, this experiment in what it means to undergo like a revolutionary process of change in this country. Like what does it mean for all of these young white people to like sing the songs of Harry Belafonte, and the collision that has to happen, that had to happen in the hearts of those people. But yeah, those are just some thoughts I've been having in the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, I just wanted to add briefly because I was thinking something pretty similar to Jeremiah. I think Harry Belafonte's legacy and also like Jeremiah mentioned, this universal outpouring of love and respect for his life and legacy. I think all of it is a justification for the Fourth American Revolution. And I agree with Emily, the statement you made that in a lot of ways, Harry Belafonte is the perfect inheritor of Paul Robeson. But what his life also justifies is that American history has advanced since the era of Robeson or since the era of the early 20s, because I think he carried that same essence of basically like King's World House into his life and his craft as a musician and as an artist. But I mean, there were just so many interesting links with, for example, his connection to folk music, like Black folk music, but then also white folk music. Because a couple of weeks ago, Shimbarto had sent me this album, Homeward Bound, and this song specifically, he covers Homeward Bound. And I looked into it a little bit, and it's actually originally a Simon and Garfunkel song. And I was so shocked because when I listened to Harry Belafonte's version, and then I listened back to the Paul Simon version, and then I went back, I was just floored because I don't know exactly how you would describe it or exactly what he brought into it, but it was like the blues or something, or some element of the African American striving that created this new synthesis, like this new American synthesis. And I think that because of the position that Harry Belafonte was placed in his life, like first being a part of the art community, but then also being the son of, I think both of his parents were immigrants from Jamaica, right? Like I find that really, really interesting. But then also growing up like African American, I think to be moral and like to be morally courageous, he had to represent like this new American people or the new American synthesis. And he really, really went there. Like he actually reminds me of Lorraine Hansberry in this way, and how toward the end of Hansberry's life, she was in Greenwich Village and she chose to write about it, like to make sense of it in her last play, like The Sign in Sidney Brewstein's Window. But yeah, because something that Harry Belafonte had mentioned in one of his interviews when he was talking about his memory of the Jamaican working songs, like I think he also talked about how his father or his grandfather was working on the docks of Jamaica, and how he said in the interview, you know, because the interviewer asked about the like his origins for becoming the artist that he was, and he said, it's difficult for me to intellectualize it, but if I had to propose an origin, you know, then I would say that over time I've realized these early subconscious memories of listening to all of these working songs of the Jamaican people really became a basis for me as I flowered into manhood. And yeah, and on that note, he also emphasized that a lot of African American art or music was not plainly African, like it was not plainly African or African American, because even in the artistic and the political history of the American Negro was the influence of a lot of Europe, for example. And yeah, I think like Emily had mentioned, I was really impressed and really fascinated by Harry Belafonte's intellect. And he was really plain in his interviews about explaining why he thinks the way he does. And the last thing I want to say is, yeah, the way that people are responding to his passing, it made me realize that a lot of people know about Harry Belafonte, especially people who are older than like 25 years old, and all types of people have some memory of him, like whether it was listening to him on the radio, like singing Deo, or you know, hearing records of him when they were young from their parents, etc. And I was also looking a lot at the YouTube comments of the videos that he was singing in, and people had really interesting comments. Like someone said, oh, one time I got on the New York subway and I saw the most handsome man I'd ever seen in my life, and he smiled at me, and it was Harry Belafonte. Like just all these things. But it made me realize, like, yeah, America's gone somewhere and America is going somewhere, and it's right there. Like it's right there for us to touch. Like people still feel it, people still remember it, and this is the foundation from which we will spring. Oh, the last thing I wanted to say, it's actually the last thing now, is that Harry Belafonte had said, I think it might have been even in the video that we just watched, he said, yeah, like the ruling class tries to suppress creative and revolutionary art and culture, but it can never really be lost, because the people will pick up what is true to their aspirations and they will continue it, but also some artifact always remains, like whether that be a script, a document, like a single record, and so it won't be lost. And yeah, I just think there's a lot for all of this that I know that I'm taking from, but I also think Free School, like we will draw from for our task looking forward.
Can I say something?
Go ahead, Kat.
Oh, it's so hard to know where to begin, because I feel like there's so much I'm also feeling. You know, Seraphine was saying there's a lot of emotion in this room, but I'm trying to also, I think, process just how much I think Harry Belafonte, whether I even knew it or not, like is one of the people that I feel like I really need, but everyone really needs in this time, to really see somebody who embodies what we've been saying, the ideals of, you know, what being a torchbearer to what Paul Robeson and Du Bois taught us about being able to find ourselves in the struggle for world humanity, but also for Black humanity and for the American people. I forget who just said that, but I just feel like, you know, we're about to continue reading Hegel. You know, we talk a lot about like beginning in the right place and like always knowing your grounding. I think that's something really important as well. But I think a couple of things we've been saying have been really, really inspiring me, because I feel like Michelle, you had mentioned that Harry Belafonte is the son of Caribbean Jamaican immigrants, and yet he also had this, you know, he innately, but also even through his experiences, this deep resonance in the African American traditions and struggle. So much so that he's almost so inseparable from like King and from Robeson and in the civil rights movement. And the person that I think of that also mirrors this, but also, you know, is inextricably linked, is the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan. And I think that that's really deep, because I didn't realize until more recently that that Minister Louis Farrakhan also is, I believe, of Caribbean descent, was a calypso singer. And I've been trying to make sense of the fact that like both people, both men, or these strong men that also like at the end of the day could have chosen to become, say, artists in a more traditional or mainstream or fame-seeking kind of sense, but actually first and foremost, they took responsibility and contributed immensely to the struggle of their people and the struggle of Black folk in America in a way that I feel like I could even say like immigrants, you know, maybe a lot like could you know, learn a little from, but also in the way that they just first and foremost thought of themselves as people who had to contribute to their people's struggle over being and seeking artists. Because I think both of them could have purely been successful recording artists, even at that time of great segregation, but not even that much of a turn, because Harry Belafonte says, and I'm forgetting which interview he said it, but I was looking at a Final Call tribute to Harry Belafonte, and said, I was an activist first and then an artist. And I think that's something that artists today really have forgotten. And I think that that's something that I appreciate that Alice brought up the example of, say, Jacob Lawrence, and so many artists from that struggle and generation say that first and foremost, that I think is a shame that artists today forget, or are even more often than not like drawn away from that path, from that calling, that higher calling that doesn't tell them to be, you know, instead of celebrities or facing or like money make, you know, so much more. And so I feel like I'm trying to and if there's more that people know about how the Nation of Islam is remembering Harry Belafonte, I know for a fact that it seems like the Minister Farrakhan is really moved by this and saddened by this loss, because I have a feeling that the two of them were really close, and they have really, in some ways, more similar trajectories than I feel like you would think. But it also just kind of goes back to what we've been saying, how essential and part of all of what we're talking about, like the Nation of Islam, is to the memory of Paul Robeson and Du Bois. You know, like the notion of like, I feel like we're talking about, in some senses, the way Harry Belafonte in that that interview we just listened to, that Emily helped put together, but also he just put it in such clear terms that like so much of his development and growth is both because of, but also that he felt moved to contribute to sort of almost what was then like the awakening of darker humanity of Africa and Asia. And, you know, in free school we've been talking about the reconstitution of humanity along Afro-Asiatic lines. There's so much there, and I really want us to get into that too. But also how we're going to Chicago in just a few weeks for a really exciting Robeson event, and put on by our colleagues, Meghna and Neha, and like the Nation of Islam student minister Ishmael, right, and speaking. And I think this connection to the nation is really important. But all that's to say, Chicago as well makes me also think of the artist Charles White, who I believe like Harry Belafonte had a really close relationship with, and I might be able to look at this in a second, but I remember just recently coming across a photo of Charles White and Harry Belafonte being really close, yeah, having this photo of them together, and how they collaborated on a lot of the images, or the sort of drawings, or the sort of his Belafonte won certain like TV specials, or even how he sat for Charles White in drawings, and also like they both shared so much in terms of understanding the power and the responsibility of the artist throughout their entire life, and always being like, yeah, that pedagogical force whenever Belafonte talks about instruction. Like, I know Charles White always, like, to the end of his life was a teacher of arts, but also to young people. And so it's just sort of that spirit that I feel also excited for our tribute to, actually, now that I think about it, yeah, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad and Paul Robeson coming up later this summer in Philadelphia. That I feel like Charles White is a part of this, but it's because we have so much that we're trying to embody, these sort of not just values, but just how they've transformed all these human beings, all these men, as you know, Doc, you always say, it's like these men who stood up, and like how that can be something that young people or people today can learn from and feel closer to the notion that we can like a new American people, the Fourth American Revolution is emerging, or can emerge, if we're able to take the spirit on.
Yeah.
Yeah, so much, yeah.
Keep talking.
So much.
Go ahead. Wait. Okay, I'll go ahead. I just wanted to say that, I mean, really, we've grown up knowing Harry Belafonte and listening to his music, but I feel like some part of his message, like Alice was also saying, and Shambhartu will probably attest to, is that some part of the message um, did not reach my generation, because I feel like in the 50s and 60s, Harry Belafonte and Paul Robeson, figures like these were celebrated in India, not just because they were artists and because they were so beautiful and such beautiful and powerful artists, but because they were seen as freedom fighters. And they reminded, intellectuals and artists and writers in India that there is this network of mutuality, which King talks about, which ties the world, and it ties them in this common aspiration towards, basically struggling for justice for all of humanity. And this is reminding me so much of, the present situation where, our comrades Nandita and Raju, they're trying to organize a conference on Paul Robeson in India, and they approach intellectuals and they approach, even members of left organizations, even just to give a tribute to Robeson, even not even to speak, like, give a presentation, but just even a tribute to Robeson. And they all cowered, they retreat and say, oh no, we don't really know Robeson like that, maybe you should talk to somebody who knows music, who knows musician, who knows something about music. And that really makes me think that the reason why they don't know Robeson or they don't know Harry Belafonte in our times is because they don't know the Indian freedom struggle, and they don't feel themselves part of this, world revolutionary movement, which was trying to strive for a new freedom, a new democracy, peace for the people, but also for human beings to become complete, which really, I think, figures like Harry Belafonte and Paul Robeson, like we have said, they represent complete human beings, a complete man. And yeah, to some extent it breaks my heart, because it's almost like there has happened among intellectuals and artists today a death of striving towards something in art, in this time. And I also wanted to add that I used to think about Harry Belafonte. I have, like, never spoken to him, never met him, but I used to think about a lot. I think about him a lot on a day-to-day basis, because him and also somebody like Diane Nash, them just being them just being in the world, it made me feel connected to this time which I really like. I feel like, I almost feel connected to, but I did not live to see. And I'm really like, it makes me sad that he's passed, but it also makes me that much more committed to carry forward the legacy, because it really lands on us now to take forward, to have that continuity with that revolutionary time of the civil rights movement, and the world anti-colonial struggle, forward. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to add, like, it was something, like, in the video that we just watched, and, Belafonte says this thing that, culture and art is what binds Black America. And, like, I think this is one of those things which we sometimes think as obvious, but I think it's actually really deep, because this is also what, Robeson says. I think he says that, all men are brothers because of their music. And, like, I was thinking that, this is like, this idea that culture really binds and actually creates a community. This is something that, uh, I think this is something that Black America and the Black struggle has to teach the world's humanity, because, because of the unique situation that, this is a people whose history had been entirely robbed, the language had been robbed, their cultures had been robbed, and they had to, like, literally, as the saying went, like, pick up by your bootstraps. Well, they did, and, this was the result of that. And this is something that I think this is something that's really important for the world to learn today. This is also, like, it reminds me of, like, how Baldwin talks about renewal, and the fact that, you have to, like, like, as a people, you have to examine yourself to the point of, to the point of almost destroying the sense of realities that you have, which does not come, authentically from the people. But you have to actually renew yourself. You have to go back to your roots. You have to understand the people's, strivings and aspirations, and that is the role of culture. I think that Belafonte and Robeson both talk about that. Culture is something. I mean, at the same time, it's something that's shaped entirely by the people, and it also shapes the future. There is this relationship that, culture is not like it's not a static idea, and it's also not just. I think this is what, one of the articles in the recent journal, that Raju and Nandita have launched, dedicated to Robeson. Yeah, that, culture has this, I think, this dialectical relationship that, it is created by the people, and it also, serves as a framework to drive the future. I think this is really deep, which, like, at this moment, unfortunately, we have nowhere to look to, uh, like, examples of this. And as Purva was saying, like, these are the people who sort of embody that time where, this was something that people understood. And increasingly, this idea of culture is not something that, is common in people's mind. We don't think about culture like that because of the ruling class takeover of culture in America and in most places of the world. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
So I just also wanted to add one really, this thing Harry Belafonte said. I have to paraphrase it because I can't remember exactly what it was, but I've really carried it with me. He said somewhere that, I wasn't an artist who turned to activism. I was a freedom fighter who turned toward art to carry forward the struggle. And I mean, I think this is something that people need to understand today. Emily was talking about this, that you cannot separate art, you cannot separate artistic aspirations and expressions from the struggle of the people. And these Belafonte, Ropes, and they really, Jacob Lawrence, Charles White, they really, really, that was their life. That's the life they led.
Yeah, to add to that, you know, it really resonated with me when Robeson said, an artist must take a stand.
Yeah.
You must take a stand. Like, there's nothing as an apolitical artist. Like, everybody, um, in today's world tries to stay away from controversy and be an independent artist and just show their art form in an unrestricted way. But we all live in this world. We're all restricted by, these ideas of democracy and freedom that are prevalent around us. And I think one of my favorite lines from this documentary was when Harry Belafonte, in the words of Paul Robeson, said that make the people sing your songs and they will want to know you and follow in your footsteps. That's your opportunity to give them instruction, to give them. It's. I have chills down my body as I say this, you know. Um, and I went to a Catholic school all my life. Um, Saint Augustine's Day School, by the way. We were based on Saint Augustine,
Okay.
and we sang Harry Belafonte songs in morning assembly. We sang Banana Boat and Taliban, and you know there was
Such a mix. Go on, go on.
but we sang his songs, but there was a delay in knowing what he meant to to our people. There was a delay in knowing what he meant to the world. But we got there eventually, and I hope that a lot more people in India and around the world sort of get his message. And I feel like um, I I was deeply saddened when I heard of his passing. It was um, it was very emotional for me, at least, because you know we grew up with his songs, and after getting to know him and Paula Robeson, and you know he speaks the language of the free school, which is the language of Paul Robeson, Du Bois, and King. You know, and a lot of this deeply resonated with me, and you know we can all mourn his loss, but I think it is our responsibility to carry his legacy forward.
I agree with you. I think, sorry, I was like, feel like every time I try to speak, I cut people off. But no, when he passed, just like you were saying, the grief that falls over all of us, because whether we knew him in his life or only got to know him in his passing, we realize what we are losing. And for me, when he passed, I had texted my grandfather because my family is Jamaican, my dad's side, and I texted him a song by Harry Belafonte, and he just went and he was like, "Oh, I love Harry, and thank you for sharing this." And it made me think a lot. How like, wow, I've never actually thought about his life because I've known his name and I've known the song Deo Banana Boat, and I've heard it remixed in lots of songs. I mean, lots of movies and whatnot. So, like Serafina had shared in the beginning of, we are separated from this political and philosophical essence and meaning of a person. And I think that's something that we still struggle with today, as we're all saying. And I think that this utility of separatism that our nation and specifically teaches, that like art and philosophy don't go together, science and art and religion and spirituality, politics, none of that stuff have to do with each other, but they are all one and the same, like you just said, Shantanu. They all make one human being. That's something that he was never shy of. And I remember I was watching a video earlier this week before I sent you all that clip of him and Danny Glover. Was he was speaking with a man at a university, and he talked about his mother, and he said, my mother gave me my first instruction. She said, Harry, if you ever see injustice in the world, don't ever let it go. If you ever go about your life and you let unjust things happen, you are an unjust person. And I was at a very young age. He said his mother, she's a Jamaican woman. She worked her whole life, and she just came into the room and sat and was dismal. And I can only imagine that his mother gave him those words because maybe she had failed to do something unjust, or maybe she was a victim of injustice. And the fact that he carried that in his spirit from basically his young wombness into his death and so on, it does speak about the dedication and really the sacrifice it takes for someone to see themselves as always responsible to carry humanity. And I was reading a piece this week on philosophy and art from the Marxist archives, and it was speaking about how, philosophy, artists put philosophy into their work, and that itself is a science. It's a category of understanding a person. It's a category of what we'll get into later too with Hegel, but it's a category of logic. And the logic of humanity is as simple as Harry puts it in all of his speaking, is that we are one common people, and we can't let the elite, the ruling class, those who are only based in the principles of separatism and individuality, we cannot let them lead us and tell us who we are. Even in our domestic conversations, I think that is so easy to neglect that. Like, even yesterday, I was talking to my friend about, I was like telling her how my YouTube reels are always showing me like people in Korea and like visiting like street vendors and like mom and shop restaurants. I'm like, oh my god, I need to go to Korea. I need to eat like Korean food in Korea. She's like, Americans aren't allowed there, and I'm just like, okay, but like that's not the point. I was like, I can go to South Korea. I can't go to North Korea. That's a whole different story. And she's like, yeah, but you wouldn't want to go there anyway. And I'm like, why? Who is telling you this? Like, we have to even think about what are the notions that we believe, and are they our actual thoughts? Were we actually consciously fostering these things, or are these fears that are fed into us? Because what Harry was saying, he's like, our nation, we do not practice a humanity right now. We do not practice that difference is unity. We don't practice loving kindness, but we can. And he is a product of America. He is a product of King and Du Bois and Robeson. And we are products of him and them and so on. So thank you, Emily, for putting that together. And I'm very glad that we're together to celebrate his life and that we're going to honor him with our exhibit and with our event in June. I'm very excited.
Yeah, it really stood out to me the way he talked about, similar to what Alice said. He felt a loss when he wasn't able to continue in school, and really, a lot of it reminds me of Huey P. Newton, and that you have a young person with this deep aspiration, and you go to school, and they try to stomp it out of you. They try to, I guess, put clouds in your sky, and make you feel less and make you feel incapable. Uh, and I actually don't know how Harry Belafonte taught himself how to read. I know Huey was through like pure willpower of just learning every book, every word in the book, sentence by sentence, over and over again, because they wouldn't teach him how to read, but they couldn't kill his aspiration. And similar to Harry Belafonte, you just see a small light in his life. He goes to a plane. He's like, wow, I want to be a part of this. There's something positive here, and I would like this for myself, and I would like this for other people. Uh, I really, when I think of somebody like Harry Belafonte, it's like he's a beautiful person, and people are beautiful. There's not just extraordinary people. There's ordinary people that make extraordinary decisions, and so I'm proud to be an American when I see somebody like him. I'm glad that we're learning about it. I didn't know about this great man before I was running with you guys either. Uh, so yeah.
Something that Belafonte says that I keep thinking about and I haven't quite figured it out is he says, like, unless we know Africa, unless we know Asia, we are unable to free ourselves from oppression. And the reason why I keep thinking about it is because, like, the free school, we've been talking a lot about an Afro-Asiatic reconstitution of the world. And like I'm trying to understand like what that really means. And like a group of us, we've been trying to turn to Robeson to understand what that means for our times, like historically, but also for our times. And, something that both Robeson says in his book, Here I Stand, in which he talks about why he, praises the Soviet Union, despite, praises the Soviet Union, but also as part of a world reordering. And he is like censored and blacked out by American media, American, like the cultural spheres as well, academic institutions. but and here I stand. Robeson speaks about this, and also Belafonte in that interview or in that clip, he talks about is this idea of Africa and Asia constituted historically, where the period in which Africa is essentially divided, but also Asia is looted and plundered, and that historical period constituted also the movement of Africans to America. Like that's what binds it together, but also in their struggle against colonialism and imperialism. But I still have like I think we're still trying to figure it out, especially as like with the festival celebrating Robeson and Elijah Muhammad, and then also later on in terms of celebrating Winston and really understanding what exactly we mean by this reconstitution or an Afro-Asiatic reconstitution, and what that means for our times. Because in the free school, we're always referring to these leaders of Africa and Asia, but even in understanding like our current affairs or the current affairs of the world, we're referring to Africa and Asia. I guess I'm more clear on Asia because since we've been talking about China, we've been talking about Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, but I think definitely on the Africa piece, we started the conversation of during the 10th anniversary of leaders like Patrice Lumumba and Guabe and others.
I was just going to, this is such an exhilarating and very moving conversation. I want to thank Sade for sharing that Harry Belafonte, Danny Glover interview. And I would encourage everybody to listen to it. Yesterday was the 205th anniversary of the birth of Karl Marx. And, you know, we should celebrate it, the great social scientists. And I think, one of the great contributions of Karl Marx was the idea that philosophy and social science are not separated from revolutionary politics. In fact, for them to develop, they must be connected to the struggles of the people, something which is kind of lost in academic circles. But, you know, the more I listen to people in the free school, it is very obvious to me that one must understand the people of this country to understand Karl Marx. That in a certain way, and this is kind of, you know, going into philosophy and Kant, that understanding Harry Belafonte is a categorical imperative to understanding Karl Marx and the Russian Revolution. Because, and here I agree with Kathy, that Belafonte consciously and intentionally carried on the work of Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois, and after his assassination, Martin Luther King. Like Baldwin said, Harry Belafonte, all of his life was this super handsome, more than handsome, just a beautiful human being. What Baldwin was saying is that at the deep unconscious level, white women who had to publicly declare that they hated Black people and feared Black men, and that was a public performance in a white supremacist environment, when confronted by Harry Belafonte, were faced with, as they say, cognitive dissonance. How do I hate black men and fear black men in the face of this beautiful man. And he was physically beautiful and deeply passionate. That's what comes across in his singing of folk songs, that he sang from a place that most artists could not imagine. So he was beautiful on the outside, but even more beautiful on the inside. It's just an unbelievable combination of what could be called a perfect human being. A lot of ways, a new human being, a person of the future.
Yeah.
And I was just looking at him. If you look at the way he gestures with his hands, well, that's Paul Robeson. That's the way Paul Robeson made his points with his hands, with his entire body. You know what I'm saying? And the other thing, this word that he kept using, instruction. They gave us instruction. I don't know that people use that word in that way that much then or now. But what he was talking about, and this, oh, by the way, for him to be so handsome and so talented and so humble at the same time, take it today. I mean, if there was such, I don't know of anybody out there today that's so handsome like Harry Belafonte. If you do, I'd like to see him. He's such a handsome man, such a talented man. In today's environment, most artists would commodify that to make money or to become a star or a celebrity. He did the very opposite. He said, it was clear throughout his life that he was saying, what is beautiful about me is what I've inherited. If I am beautiful, it's not because of me.
Yeah.
It is because of an inheritance, a legacy, and as he would put, the instruction I got. So this is a person who dropped out of high school. The instruction, which I also interpret that word as the pedagogy of W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson.
Yeah.
The pedagogy, like we said in the 10th anniversary, the moral, spiritual, and political education of children and youth. And children and youth must be morally, spiritually, and politically educated. And we must constantly seek pedagogies, ways of instruction, of separating the noise of bourgeois commodified culture from the essence of people's culture. The other thing is this anchorage in the Black proletariat. It's unavoidable. Just the last thing, we make the claim that the civil rights movement was a third American revolution. Well, if you wanted proof of that, look at who was in the leadership of that movement. They were revolutionaries. Harry Belafonte, unapologetically, is a revolutionary. His mentors, those who instructed him, to use his language, were themselves revolutionaries. He crystallizes as a political figure at the height of the American Cold War against the Soviet Union. But yet he emerges out of the anti-fascist struggle against Hitler, against that form of imperialism, against this strike force. Nazi Germany was the strike force of world imperialism. You know, this narrative, this revisionist narrative that, well, we were democracies fighting against Nazism. No. Many of the aims, I would say the essential aims of Hitler and the Nazis in Germany, and they said this, were not different than the aims of other imperialist countries, including the United States. They wanted Hitler to destroy the Soviet Union. Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois joined the anti-Hitler struggle, not just to defeat Hitler, but to defend the Soviet Union.
Right, right.
So when the World War II ends and the United States moves from an ally of the Soviet Union to its mortal enemy, Du Bois and Robeson said, we did not fight fascism to now join the United States government in a war against the Soviet Union. We fought fascism for democracy and for the defense of socialism in the Soviet Union. This lesson, it's very simple when you think about it, is what most young leftists have no idea about. And therefore, they cannot properly read Marx or Lenin or any revolutionary because they have no anchorage in their own history. And it is so tragic that most young white leftists, and again, quote unquote, do not see the Black struggle as organic to the struggle of the American people and the American working class. Who are the American revolutionaries? For most young leftists, they would prefer Trotsky over Du Bois. I don't want to go, a lot into, I know, back and forth. That is a tragic error, a tragic mistake. And if you don't get that straight, you can never be a revolutionary in this country. You can talk about revolution. You can talk about how much you love Karl Marx. You can talk about the Russian Revolution, maybe the Chinese Revolution. But you will never understand your own country. Well, maybe you don't see this as your country. And therefore you cannot understand the great Harry Belafonte. He was a revolutionary. And my own experience, I feel he became more revolutionary, especially after the assassination of Martin Luther King. He grieved that assassination for the rest of his life. Grieved it. And was motivated by it.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was not going to let the ruling class do what they did to Du Bois and Robeson and then assassinate King and then just shut his mouth. He committed himself to speak against this ruling class with all that he had in him till the day he died. Now, that's a revolutionary hero. I agree with everybody. Agree with Alice the way she put it. You're looking for a revolutionary hero? Here it is. If you have problems with that, the next question is, well, what is your problem? What is your problem? That's a question that I ask all the time. Like Belafonte said, who is instructing you that you can't see Belafonte? That you don't understand what he's saying? Just my last thing. I was so appreciative of Danny Glover and the respectful way that he got out of the way to allow Belafonte to speak. That's the way you conduct a respectful interview. Sometimes it's best to keep your mouth shut, and it shows your intelligence to respect a Belafonte. I guess just one last, I keep saying, you know, Belafonte did not die a rich or wealthy man. He didn't intend to be that. He intended to live and die like Robeson and Du Bois and King. None of them died with wealth. But he wanted to be an example. You know, Nathan and I have been talking about, for the year of Baldwin, which is next year, and we're going to celebrate, pulling together a men's discussion group. I think I proposed to Nathan that we call it a gathering. We draw men from the Church of the Overcomer, from the Church of the Crucifixion, from the Nation of Islam, and other, it's free school, of course, to talk about, in a nation and a culture that is trying to confuse everybody about these things, what does it mean to be a man? To say that is not, as some would have it, to descend into, quote, toxic masculinity. It is to say, what does it mean to be a human being? And one of the things I think is that we see in Belafonte a man who, in other words, to fight for freedom defines and anchors his manhood. He is not trying to put on a show or performance of, quote, a man that's a, quote, feminist or ambiguous or whatever. But he is saying that the essentials of being human, and hence being a man and a black man, is to be a revolutionary. And that's what he was. I think the study of his life, the study of his evolution, the study of him shows us that. And I, like the way Eddie put it, man, it makes you proud to be an American. If this is America, the America that the ruling class is attempting to suppress.
Somehow there's no one more American than Harry Belafonte or Paul Robeson.
That's absolutely. I think they define what to be American is. That's what he's saying, or King. This is the new America, the fourth American Revolution. This defines the parameters of class conflict whose purpose is to remake a people and remake a nation in a world that is being remade by an Afro-Asian reconfiguration. Two profoundly significant processes, both of which must be understood in their depth and complexities. An Afro-reconstitution of humanity, which itself is a democratic process, and a fourth American Revolution to remake a nation based upon its previous revolutions. These two dialectically, they are not the same, but they are dialectically joined. And that's, I think that's the vision of the free school, and I think it's verified, it's confirmed when you listen to Belafonte?
Yeah, I guess all this has me thinking that I think people need to know more or need to have more examples like Harry Belafonte, because especially like young men, so that you can know that you can have a place in this world, and that if you fight for it, similar to like what my brother was saying, that he was an ordinary man who made the choice every day, to honor the people that came before him, and honor those struggles. So I just think that, as for that men's group, it is important to have, especially with the nation, especially with the Church of the Overcomer, is you have, and especially of course with free school and doc and everything, is that you get to see proof, I guess, proof that people are capable of making these decisions, and proof that people are capable of standing up for something. So, yeah.
Yeah, just the conversation about manhood made me think about Baldwin, because this is like the side of Baldwin, the revolutionary side of Baldwin, which has been suppressed, and which I think the ruling class is trying to distort and to turn Baldwin into like, yeah, all of these, like an icon of like the LGBT movement and all this stuff. But I actually remember like being in college when I feel like I was probably more drawn to, I guess, like identity politics stuff, and being actually pretty uncomfortable reading Baldwin, because he will say things like, a man is a man cannot become a woman. Like, I'm not like, where it's like he'll also speak as like, I'm a man, like I have to take care of my wife and my children, and he'll use that voice. And I remember being kind of uncomfortable because I was like, oh, is Baldwin like anti-trans or something? And yeah, but like that's the side, like that's like the revolutionary manhood that Baldwin exemplifies, that you actually have to face that. And yeah, like that for me has been also, yeah, like a very important lesson, whether it's Baldwin or someone like Belafonte. And yeah, like I'm really excited, I guess, to see what comes out of that next year. But yeah, just wanted to add.
Glad you brought up Baldwin. Oh, can you hear? Sorry. I wanted to add to your point about Baldwin because, yeah, I agree that the way that we interpret now these revolutionary figures to be anti whatever we say that they are, it really does speak to that separatism. It speaks to the fact that we haven't progressed our language. We've actually detached ourselves from the language of our leaders and created a new vocabulary that actually says that what they're saying is not humanity. What they're saying is anti-human. It's not for the advancement of the people, but that's why we have to work so hard to really ask ourselves, as Harry Belafonte was said through what Tony was saying, like who was instructing you, and what is their propaganda, or what is their pedagogy, what is their mission? Because it's so frustrating. It honestly is when you catch yourself, you know, saying these things that you're not even sure that you've consciously come to believe. You're just saying what is instilled in you, what is injected in you. And it's so easy to go through that pattern because we've all been victims of it, and we're all being, pressed to this iron of like, this is what you have to say, this is what you have to do if you want to continue to progress in this world. But to be a true American, as Harry said, and as we're all saying, is to be a universal person, is to accept China, is to accept Russia, is to accept Africa, Asia, is to see that there is a commonality in all of us. And that comes at the very core and the love of humanity, which Robeson instructed into Belafonte. And what I think that we're all being instructed with his death, there's actually, I think, going to be a birth of this desire to learn, the desire to be one people, and to be a humanity. But I think too, what is most important is that we don't separate and that we don't compartmentalize like artists, and we can't look at something and only pull the good out of it. We have to see it in its fullness, and we have to say, you know, maybe it's maybe the logic of this doesn't make sense, and if it doesn't make sense, why is that? And I know that that's a difficult task. It's a difficult task for me because I know that I very much do love art, and sometimes you look at something or you hear something and you just like it, you just love it, and you don't really think about what its message is. But we have to continue to look deeper, and we have to continue to make ourselves worthy of Belafonte and Du Bois and Baldwin and King.
To add, I was gonna talk about manhood. I don't know if you wanted to switch the topic. To add to the topic of manhood, I think that the ruling class has been assaulting the people, pretty much nonstop barrage, especially with the fall of, or I guess the death of King, and like strong leadership that, and anywhere from the institutions that the people have, good opportunities at work, public education, and especially the family. And I think part of the way that the family has been assaulted has been to attack strong men, which I guess Baldwin said is supposed to be the protector and the provider of the family. And with words like with anywhere from words like toxic masculinity to, I guess, mass incarceration, both physical and the ideological assaults on the concept of the man, taking advantage of this confusion that I think exists because we live in a new world now, with what you would call the modern world, and men and women relationship cannot be exactly the same because the world's not the same. So you need a new man and a new woman, and I think they've taken advantage of this confusion and this thing that has to be worked out, to basically attack the man, and even get society and even the women to attack the men, instead of men and women defending and protecting each other, and operating as a unit. So I really think that, and you have a lot of popular figures right now that are kind of taking, I would say, yeah, in some ways taking advantage of the confusion, and in some way offering a solution. I guess the most popular figure being somebody like Andrew Tate, which I think people deserve a little better, even if I see some partial truths. And so I think that this is a opportune time to try to work some of this stuff out as well. And some of it has to be from the past, brought forward, and then I don't know if we need new concepts, but somebody like James Baldwin sounds like the perfect guy to help us out.
Well, I wasn't going to pivot that much from manhood because the conversation of manhood is also the conversation of like the people's struggle for freedom and to be new human beings. But I wasn't sure if you wanted to say something, Doc. I was going to talk about something you had, like, just lift up something you had said again. For some reason, I thought a lot about, I also really was attached to the word instruction. And yeah, it's really like, it was very emotional discovering Harry Belafonte because of how much he saw himself as such a student and disciple of Du Bois and Robeson and King after his assassination. Like how close, because you could tell that when King was alive, he very much both was a confidant and friend of King, but then especially with King's death, it was almost like whenever you hear Harry Belafonte talk about King, or the great freedom struggle that is the civil rights movement, first of all, you can tell that he understands the civil rights movement as revolutionary, but also there's almost a fierce, you can tell that Harry Belafonte has a very fierce responsibility. Like he sees himself as very much like fiercely responsible to something that he won't let die. Both his friend, but what King represented for the people. And yeah, I just very much agree with this thing of that we have to seek out pedagogies, because I just think Belafonte in his life, there's something so moving, just like everyone has said, there's something so moving about him self-describing his life, that someone like Robeson gave him a way to understand himself and his purpose. And I just wanted to talk about Robeson because I've been reading Coretta Scott King's autobiography from like it must have been right after when King was assassinated. But she also talks about Robeson, where she says she was like, Robeson was the one who also taught me to, like, basically, he's the one who encouraged me to pursue my voice, not as just a technical vocalist, but that he was the one who gave her a pedagogy or an instruction of, like, just like he told Harry Belafonte that if you sing, if you can make the people if you can make the people hear your song, they will want to know you. And if they want to know who you are, like, you will give them an alternative to what they already know. Like, you will like introduce a whole another dimension of the world, and you will give them different choices in life. And yeah, I just want to read a quote that she said about being an artist or a vocalist inspired by Robeson. Like, Robeson was that great teacher, not just for Harry Belafonte, but for so many people at that time, including King to a certain extent, including King, but also Coretta Scott King. And she says, she's talking about graduating from Antioch, where she says, "This was the foundation upon which I felt that I could build a career in music. Somehow I had always had a strong desire to develop all my talents, as well as every aspect of my personality, in order to make the greatest contribution possible to society. Embodied in this attitude was the belief that each individual's life is purposeful and that he has a special role to play, that he has a responsibility to himself, to his fellow man, and to his creator, to give back to society in proportion to his ability and opportunities." And it's just really moving because I do feel like in Du Bois and Robeson, in the examples of their lives, but the way they also clearly, like, their life was in dedication to like the immortal child. Like, their life was in dedication to children. And you can see the impact in the ripple effects of, like, it's what Sade said, where Sade was like, Harry Belafonte and Coretta Scott King, they're products of Robeson and Du Bois. And then you could say Robeson and Du Bois they're the products of a history, the Black proletariat, America's revolutionary history. And there's something, like Shantanu said, it gives you chills, like, to think about it, because we're products. Like, yeah, just like Sade said, we're products of Harry Belafonte, Coretta Scott King. The American people, the ones, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., all those people across America who are discontented, who are revisiting King, the ones who are unhappy with whatever you want to call it, the swampers, the ruling elites, we're products of a great revolution called the Third American Revolution. And there's something very emotional about that the American people will never be the same. And Harry Belafonte is proof, but also, like, we are proof. And the emerging new American people, that's proof. But the last thing I wanted to say was also, which is to exactly agree with what you were saying, Doc, that you cannot, like, in order to appreciate Marx's great contribution, to understand the Russian Revolution's world historic contribution, if you're an American, you can only get to that place to really, like, really appreciate Marx today. You can only do that when you understand your own American people who have been fundamentally shaped by this revolutionary tradition and the revolutions, especially the Third American Revolution, the Civil Rights Movement. And yeah, Harry Belafonte actually wrote a song for Martin Luther King called Martin Luther King. And I wanted to read some of the lyrics because he wrote it in 1991. And I feel like in it, you can tell that Harry Belafonte, he has a strong sense of, like, my friend died and, like, I have to live a life for him. Like, it's like, he's like, I have to live it for him. But the lyrics go, as I wandered round the world so lost and angry, he called me home and reached out for my hand. He spoke with words that sounded more like music, the words my heart could finally understand. He showed me pride and said I could feel better, but no better than the smallest of the small. He showed me victories where no one loses. He showed me the answer for us all. And the song I sing for you, sweet Martin Luther King. And the song I sing for you, sweet Martin Luther King. And he walked the people gathered round him, open arms, the only weapons that they bore. He wore us into cloth of many colors, and armed with love, he marched us off to war. And the song I sing for you, sweet Martin Luther King. And the song I sing for you, sweet Martin Luther King. The more he spoke of love, the more they feared him. The more he spoke the truth, their lives would grow. Then suddenly, with no goodbyes, we lost him. My sweet black Prince of Peace, I miss you so. They cut his dreams down thinking they would not flower, but he planted seeds everywhere he'd gone, so that someday in an endless field of colors, a million dreams would bloom to carry on. And the song I sing for you, sweet Martin Luther King. And the song I sing for you, sweet Martin Luther King. And this is, and because just like some of the people we talk about, Harry Belafonte, he experienced some of his closest friends be brutally assassinated in America, but also his great heroes around the world be punished, like Du Bois and Robeson, these great revolutionary leaders of Africa, Asia, and beyond, brutally assassinated. And here you have Harry Belafonte write a song where he says, he doesn't like, it's not just grief. He says like, I, with my life, the remainder of my life, I will make the most for both of us. And I feel like there's a pedagogy in that, but yeah, that was just really moving.
Yeah, to add to that, he had come back to Philadelphia at the end of Paul Robeson's life to see him. And
I didn't know that.
yeah, I forget what year it was, but Paul Robeson was living in West Philly, and he was sick. And at this point, Paul Robeson had become like a friend to Harry Belafonte in the same way that King had become somebody in Harry Belafonte's life and Harry Belafonte in their lives that are ultimately tied to the commitment that they all made to make a better world. And so he had a lot of feeling when he had come and seen Paul Robeson, because he was seeing somebody on their deathbed, and somebody who was so many things in Harry Belafonte's life. And one of the things that he said they talked about was the sacrifices that Paul Robeson had made, in which Harry Belafonte said that, well, what is the sacrifice if I had the most closest confidant being King in my life? What sacrifices are really what cost is there for me to pay that are so great if I stood beside King throughout his life? And he stood on and Harry Belafonte stood on principle to continue exactly what you're saying, Emily, and continuing the march toward freedom for all people. And I think he had asked Paul Robeson, or maybe Paul Robeson had just said to him that it's almost like at the end of the day, or like, and also in this interview, Harry Belafonte was having a bit of a tug of war with the person who was interviewing him.
Yeah, which interview is that?
This is on PBS.
Oh, okay.
So it wasn't the best interview, because I don't think the interviewer had any big intellect, nor did he care enough. But the conversation went like this, where Paul Robeson had told Harry Belafonte almost a prophetic thing, that the generations are responsible for themselves. And that's also one of the things that he remembered from the as one of the last things that Paul Robeson had said to Harry Belafonte. But just in consideration of like continuing the struggle out of King is ultimately important for every generation.
Yeah.
Do we have any? Is there a chat that we comments?
Some comments. Could I just add to what, like, one quick thing? Something that I forgot to say was that I think part of well, I'm really glad that Emily read that song and that poem by Belafonte. I think because it is kind of a question of pedagogy, and like even the discussion today, it kind of, in a way, it's like by talking so much and sharing these stories about someone like Harry Belafonte, it's like they become part of our world, and then a part of them becomes part of us. And I think when you talk about also the moral imperative, the categorical imperative, it's like every child, like every child in the United States and basically every child in the world is a potential Harry Belafonte or a potential Paul Robeson or a potential James Baldwin. How can you not act to try to bring that out of every child? Because yeah, part of them already does exist within them, but also like what we are doing every weekend, but with our celebrations, our events is, yeah, to like make these figures part of the world of children, and in turn to make, you know, someone like Belafonte or Paul Robeson, like, yeah, to make it so that those figures live within them. And it reminds me too of, there's this Ossie Davis quote when I think it was like during the Bush Jr. presidency, where he says, you know, Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell have their commander in chief in George Bush. My commander in chief is Martin Luther King, and he gave me marching orders, and I'm going to keep marching to that drumbeat for the rest of my life, which I feel like is kind of the way that Belafonte also saw things. But yeah, I just wanted to share that because I think, yeah, like even the discussion today, it's like, yeah, like it puts a part of like Harry Belafonte into each one of us that is just more fleshed out and becomes part of like our world and how we want to live. But just to get to some of the comments, we have a lot of people saying good morning: Todd Doherty, Emil Palmier, Philip Logan, Ware Pilgrim on YouTube, Neha, Jacob. I think someone named Al Rafi on Facebook. I think they're saying greetings, and then someone named Munis YKI on YouTube says good evening from China. And then do you want to read?
Yeah, and then Ron Fraser was talking about Sean O'Casey, I think the play title, Juno and the Paycock. And then is just quoting some parts from Free School, like get them to sing your song. The idea that Harry Belafonte had to be courageous to be part of this new American generation. And specifically like the civil rights movement as being revolutionary. And then Jake says there's beauty in difference. I agree with Michelle. These Black singers that bring the blues, they take the songs and take them over. Thinking of singers like Stevie Wonder, Donny Hathaway, Nina Simone, and Aretha. And he is, yeah, like he wants to say, yeah, never let injustice go. That's an idea to live by. And then Emil has a poem, I think, by Pablo Neruda, which is an ode to Paul Robeson. And it's really beautiful. It goes, once he did not exist, but his voice was there, waiting. Light parted from the darkness, day from night, earth from primal waters. And the voice of Paul Robeson was divided from silence. Because you sing, they know that the sea exists and that the sea sings. They know that the sea is free, wide, and full of flowers as your voice, my brother. The sun is ours. The earth will be ours. Tower of the sea, you will go on singing. And Todd really liked that. He also really liked what you were saying, Emily. I think the song that Belafonte made for Martin Luther King. And then Neha also says, thank you, Free School, for this moving tribute to Belafonte. His and Robeson's lives define what art based in moral values can offer to people, a sense of agency to claim the future. It is in the same revolutionary spirit we claim our history, that he, Belafonte, and Paul Robeson belong to all of us. This history has shaped us even if we don't recognize it immediately, and by knowing them and understanding their lives, we understand ourselves and our place in the world.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think all of that is really important because I think I haven't had that much to say because I feel like I've been trying to process it where I'm really sad because like I didn't even really know Harry Belafonte. Like I'd heard of him and I'd even like known some of the songs like the Banana Boat song and stuff, but I didn't know like who Harry Belafonte was. And like learning about all of these connections, but then also feeling like there's so much time that's passed and there are all these connections that are like basically waiting for people to, I guess, uncover and rediscover. But yeah, like it just feels like somebody really great has passed. And the connection to Paul Robeson, I think, like the singing, and I feel like the thing too is that the art, like through their art, like that was their pedagogy too. Like they passed it on so like beautifully to us. And thinking about like Neruda, like all these people around the world who knew Robeson and I think could recognize like Belafonte too as basically a new, like somebody in that generation. Yeah.
I think the last thing I wanted to say about Belafonte that you said, Doc, was the way you said it really clearly that for Belafonte, what he says over and over again, but also what you can see in how he acts, it's like I think what makes him so humble is he says, like, what makes me beautiful, what is beautiful about me is my inheritance. Like what makes me beautiful is it's not mine, right? But it's like mine in the sense that this tradition that I've inherited, these ideas, which is why like you can't find it. It's really rare to find an interview where he doesn't kind of just offhandedly list Du Bois or Robeson because that's his essence. Like,
Mhm.
and he basically wants you to know that if you think I'm beautiful, it's not just me, it's because of my inheritance. And to me, that really reminded me of Free School too, because it's the way that we kind of like sometimes I think people in my life, like especially for my friends from home, like Boston, like when I talk to them, like now that all my friends are getting married and my sister's getting married, and I have to interact with people that I haven't seen in a long time, it's hard to not just like be like, oh yeah, like Robeson said, or like Du Bois said, or remember like how Baldwin said, because in some ways that's who I am now. And that's our inheritance. And I think the reason why it also makes me emotional to think about Belafonte is that in some ways it's like Belafonte really resonates with me, where he too sees himself as a student. Like you can almost map yourself on him. Um, and the way he has lived his life, like yeah, just the way he's lived his life according to a history that he stands upon, and he doesn't take it for granted, but instead sees it as so essential that he's like, I need to make sure that others, like I'm a messenger, like it's similar to how we see ourselves as messengers. But I just really love the way you said that, Doc, like that Belafonte, it's just clear in who he is that he's like, what makes me beautiful, like I know I'm beautiful because of my inheritance. And it's also what makes him so strong. Like
Mhm.
it makes him strong. Like strong as a man.
And I know Jeremiah and I are reading Norman Finkelstein's book on cancel culture and identity politics, and a good part of it we could agree with. I think, and I was texting this back and forth with Jeremiah. I think there's a problem in the left, quote unquote. I always have to put quotes around this because it is not the left that I see or I identify with. I think Finkelstein makes a huge mistake in identifying the left with Bernie Sanders. It's a huge mistake. Now, if you want to say Bernie Sanders in relationship to the great left tradition of Du Bois and Robeson and Belafonte, then you have a different lens. If Bernie Sanders is your left, then you're going to have to do what Finkelstein is doing now, backtracking and trying to explain Bernie Sanders' support of maybe one of the great war presidencies in the history of the United States, maybe the greatest, not one, the greatest, which is bringing us so close to nuclear confrontation. How do you explain this guy? If that's the left, if that's introducing left politics into the election, no. I mean, you can give Bernie his due if you wish to. But if you want to talk about the grounding and foundation of American left, it's so apparent. It is Belafonte that is the great tribune of the left, of the people, of the working class. But, and maybe somebody could help me with this. Why can we see it so clearly and people who are celebrated intellectuals and writers can't see it? How do you not call yourself a leftist and not know the place of Robeson and Belafonte and Du Bois and King as the revolutionary forces? And with like Kathy and Sarah and everybody is saying, this is the heritage that we inherit and attempt to take forward. Without this heritage, there is no revolutionary movement. Without this. So what are you talking about? The free school reads Hegel. And in reading Hegel, we're reading a big part of Marx because Marx and his associates were Hegelians. I mean, I don't know how to put that in here. They were Hegelians. They called themselves young Hegelians. So we read Hegel. We read Hegel because King and Du Bois and Lenin read Hegel. Revolutionaries read Hegel. But in so doing, we do not lose ourselves in Hegel. And this is very important. I think that, like the work that we do, and many people underestimate that what we do in free school is work. It's very important and difficult work. It's not easy. And that's what, Emily, I hear you very, very much. I mean, how do you talk to people for whom there is no future? It is just the now and the me. What do I say to you? As beautiful as the now and the me might be for you, in terms of your education, your job prospects, you say getting married and so on and so forth. All of that is beautiful. But what if The world for me is the world of humanity and the world coming into being. What if that's my perspective? If that is my perspective, then how do I read Hegel?
Yeah.
How do I read Kant? If I know Belafonte and that struggle and that courage and that passion and that beauty, how then do I read the words of Kant or Hegel? Their words are not always beautiful, by the way. You know, one thing is for certain. I don't look back to over 200 years ago. I read Hegel to understand how the future might unfold. You know, can you read Hegel without being an academic Hegelian? I think you can. But you know, like Henry Winston said, we drink from the fount of wisdom wherever it is. And in free school, we're always talking about synthesis, this Lenin Du Bois synthesis. A lot of people say, oh, that's just the free school. They're not hardcore Marxists. We, the hardcore, you know, and I get, you know, if I would just shut my mouth after this. You know, this idea that people feel that they must say before they say anything, I'm a Marxist, which in the larger configuration of things means very little. Recall that in the free school, we made the point, we have gone not from Das Kapital to Hegel, we went from Black Reconstruction. And the reason we did so is that Black Reconstruction provides an empirical as well as philosophical framing of history and a historical moment, a revolutionary moment, by which we can test what is for Hegel and Kant hypothetical. It is not yet proven. Although Hegel attempts in using the natural sciences in science of logic to prove the point that things exist in motion and dialectically. But when it comes to social science, the hypothetical becomes provable or verifiable with a text like Black Reconstruction in America. But even more than all of that is the fact, and this is Belafonte so passionately, so beautifully, I am responsible to lead my people, our nation. This is a huge responsibility. If you don't start with that moral imperative, well, it's easy to become an academic. Academics are not driven by any great responsibility or commitment. They're not. But if you see yourself bound to a people, to an imperative to help this people see their way through the noise and so on produced by the ruling class, to see the possibility of themselves becoming new, of them being the agents of a new people, of a new nation, to help them to see that they can achieve their nation, to help them to see that. And until the so-called left assumes its responsibility to a future of this people based upon this history and based upon the great revolutionary leaders that this people have produced. People that want to say, well, we don't have any great revolutionary leaders. Well, I hate to put it this way. That is an unconscious capitulation to white supremacy, because you don't see Martin Luther King or W.E.B. Du Bois as revolutionary leaders. Oh, they're just black leaders. Or from the free schools perspective, Martin Luther King is a father of a new people. Is there anything wrong with saying that? What's the problem? What is the problem that others will not say that? Why? It is absolutely clear. But let us look everywhere else, and especially European thinkers, and try to find a solution to this problem. I think it's a great problem, and I agree with what you all say. It is difficult, and I know for myself, it is a bit, I would say, to put it, a bit frustrating that so many people that claim to be revolutionaries, that claim to be educated, cannot see what's right in front of them. And I say to them, well, if you have time, if you want to make time, listen to the conversation between Danny Glover and Harry Belafonte. If you have time, and I know you leftists are so busy, try to read Paul Robeson's Here I Stand. You know what I'm saying? If you want anchorage, if you want grounding, if you want even what Kant and Hegel call a categorical imperative, a framing, a mediation to give framing to your various theories, and I would say maybe experiences, which are not as, quote, rich as your theories are more rich than your experiences. That's part of the problem. I would say look at this revolutionary tradition. Look at what we in the free school call the enslaved proletariat. Slavery is not a class category. Slavery is a form of labor. You have to anchor the concept slavery in a class category. So in modernity, that is the rise of capitalism, when you see the slave, you're looking at an enslaved proletariat, separated from the world proletariat only by the fact that it is chattel, property. But that does not deny its proletariat character and how it functions within the global political economy of capitalism as a proletariat, not as its generalized slave.
Yeah. We have a comment from Alish Klein, who is responding to the part about Finkelstein and says, "Good morning. I don't think that Finkelstein would dispute that." I'm not sure what she's referring to, but she says that Finkelstein seems to refer to it, meaning the mainstream liberals who refer to themselves as the progressive left, as quote unquote the so-called left, at least in interviews, although I haven't gotten to his new book yet, but it's on the shelf. Yeah, I think the interesting thing about Finkelstein is that it's not just him, but I think that there are actually many people, whether it's like you call them on the left, or like the anti-establishment thing, or actually I think that they're being pushed towards the legacy of King and of Du Bois, and perhaps not even of their own willingness, but because the situation in America is pushing them towards that. And you can see it with Finkelstein, where because he's responding to things like Ibram Kendi and the white fragility thing, he feels the need to go back to Du Bois. But if you're only evaluating it from the standpoint of like, is his critique of someone like Ibram X. Kendi, is it like logically sound? Like, it's fine. But if you're evaluating it as an introduction to Du Bois, it fails. And I think I say that in part because we have spent the past year and more time beyond that reading like Black Reconstruction, reading the Souls of Black Folk. And it's not just to like toot our own horn, but if your takeaway, as Finkelstein's is, if your takeaway from the Souls of Black Folk or from Black Reconstruction is only the narrowest things from that book, then either you're missing something because of like certain ideological preconditional frameworks that don't allow you to see it, or you're deliberately just not seeing it. Like if your only takeaway from Black Reconstruction is the narrowest things, or if your takeaway from Du Bois is only the smallest things, the narrowest things, then that is intellectually irresponsible and politically irresponsible. And I think that people turn to someone like Finkelstein because he represents the tradition of like the old left or the classic left, or I guess he was maybe more tied to the new left because he was a Maoist.
Yeah.
But they turn to him because they see him as like someone who can tell them about the past generations of the left. And I think that Finkelstein has a responsibility to try to convey that legacy and to convey that history. But I think if he's trying to basically introduce a new generation to like this legacy, then one, he doesn't fully understand it, and then because he doesn't fully understand it, he fails to introduce that legacy to this new generation, who are hungry and who want to know and who are hungry for knowledge. And that's kind of how I've been reading it, I guess, because I'm like in the middle of the book, but it's very slow going.
It's may I just say something on that? I think because how would you say Finkelstein represents the opposite of what, let us say, we're trying to elucidate through Harry Belafonte.
Yeah.
It is the opposite. You see, Du Bois is a huge figure now. If you want to make a case against Ibram Kendi, which is not difficult, by the way, it is not difficult. I mean, to find all of the contradictions in Kendi's work, and to then conclude that it is superficial and so on. Well, it is. That's, by the way, the biggest part of Finkelstein's book is on Ibram Kendi. So the question becomes, why do you invoke Du Bois in a very superficial way to show an alternative to Ibram Kendi? Du Bois would say this, but then you miss the point of Du Bois, because your argument is that identity politics and cancel culture undermines class politics. Well, the question is, what for you constitutes class politics, or a theory of class struggle and class liberation in the United States? Well, for Finkelstein, it is not Du Bois. So you invoke a trivialized, superficial understanding of Du Bois against a very superficial theory of Ibram X. Kendi. So are you invoking Du Bois to give moral authority to your anti-Kendi argument? You're not interested in Du Bois, you're interested in saying Kendi is not Du Bois. Well, that's not hard to find. That's obvious. But then how do you appropriate? What do you know about Du Bois? Now, see, the question of class politics for him is a question of Marxist politics. He, or most of the people, Aaron Mate, or Glenn Greenwald and them, they would never associate Du Bois's work with class politics. Never. Part of it is because, and I say this, and whoever wishes to disagree is welcome to. I don't know. There are very few white thinkers and academics that would associate any Black person with class politics. Certainly not Du Bois. This is very significant because what Belafonte is saying, in essence, and when he says instruction, the instruction that he gets from Du Bois and Robeson is class instructions, not just Black instructions, class instructions. You see what I'm saying? I just find the trivialization, and that's what Belafonte is saying. These are huge figures. To trivialize them as a Black thinker, which means they have meaning primarily or solely to Black people and the Black struggle, which is the, come on. Have you ever read him or them? Can you understand why Robeson was singing to the Welsh miners and singing the Chinese national anthem and the Russian national anthem, the Soviet? I mean, come on, why is he doing that? Who sees power in China and Russia? The working class. What was Robeson linking the Black struggle to? The global class struggle. Is that hard? Or is it because the category, we said this before, part of the problem of a lot of young leftists, the categories through which they try to understand the world are inadequate to the world. Wrong categories. I agree with Kant. We think through categories. Science is conducted through categories. Physics, 4-dimensional space, 3 space dimensions in one time. These are categories of thinking. Wrong categories, you will not be able to understand the world that you're trying to understand. And I think this is a huge problem. So I would say, and me and I'm not as far along as Jeremiah is. He's a better reader than I am. But and you're right about the book. It is pedantic. Even after you finish reading it, it does not. Here's Belafonte. There's no instruction about what do we do. Like we talk about the Afro-Asian reconfiguration of humanity. Oh, how could, well, why don't you say it? Because you don't think it. You don't think it because you can't believe it, even though it's right in front of you. You can't think it because you can't believe it, or you don't want to believe it. What does it mean that the world is being reconfigured in such a way that Europe will be a part of but not hegemonic in? What does it mean when Baldwin says the United States, I say, becoming the last white nation? Can you think that white people will cease to be white or cease to want to be white in the name of their own humanity? That's James Baldwin. You can't see it, you can't think it because you don't want to.
Right.
Because there is something going on here that is not philosophical, ideological, or even theoretical. It's more psychological. It's at the level that I'm terrified, and I guess I'm being Baldwin now, I'm terrified at a future where white people are not privileged. Terrified of that. And I see this working in so much of what goes on among white leftists. It is sad, even for young people. And that's why, I'm sitting around here. Here I am with Serafina and Kathy, and we're all emotional together, and I'm listening to you all. You all think in ways very different than the white left. The door to the free school remains open. But one thing the free school fights for is principled relationships. That's not an easy thing to achieve. It's easy to have transactional relationships. You do something for me, I do something for you, that type of thing. It's easier to have relationships of bad faith where the difficult questions never come up. Most relationships are like that. That's why people try to proclaim, I'm in love, so I don't have to raise no difficult questions. And then, because when you raise the difficult questions, then, well, anyway. But the difficult questions are questions of history. On what side of history do you stand on? And I think I am so grateful to Sade for sharing that interview. That was so important, Sade, because it confirms what we're trying to become ourselves. We want to be like Harry Belafonte. That's who we want to be like. And in so doing, the categorical imperatives as we see them are different than if we don't know or don't want to be like Harry Belafonte.
He's on mute.
Yeah, that was a mic drop moment. now that Doc knows how to mute himself, we have silence. I don't yeah. Well, I think the one thing I wanted to respond to is
Always think of
that you said Harry Belafonte, the instruction he got from Robeson and Du Bois was class instruction. To say, see, I think that's an important point because there's an assumption that like, oh yeah, he got black instruction from Robin, but it's what do you see black versus class? And because we've been talking a lot about Trotsky and Trotskyism and the whole zeitgeist of Trotsky that has been, I feel like more, because to be honest, I've been reflecting a lot about my time at college too, where I feel like there is always this, I don't even know if I'm using the word zeitgeist right, but there's always a little bit of a zeitgeist of Trotsky where
It's all over the place. Yeah.
especially with youth on college campuses where that's like a huge recruitment ground
Yes.
for Trotskyist groups, especially if you go to school in a city where there's much more political threads and the presence of a lot of groups. But like, yeah, you have this article, Doc, where you said Trotskyism, the racist voice of the left. I think, right? I think maybe the title I missed.
No,
There's
that's right.
there. But just this thing of that Trotskyists always like there's always this thing that there's a distinction between the black struggle and
And
then
the
the
class.
class struggle. But then it's like you said, Doc, well, how do you explain when you read Robeson, where Robeson says, it is exactly because I am African American, because I am a descendant of the Black proletariat. I am a descendant of the people who made this country, whose blood and sweat is in the country, who lifted up industry in this country, in some ways lifted up the world. How do you explain that Robeson says, it is exactly because I'm an African American and I'm responsible and a descendant of my people that I look at the Welsh miners, the Scottish, that I even can sing like the songs of the Jewish people, that I can go anywhere in the world and see myself in them.
Yeah.
And even like, yeah, it's interesting because that's also Du Bois too in his life, his life's work, which is that he can see in the great struggle of China or the Indian struggle or the anti-colonial movements across the world, that he can see himself in them because he's operating from a category that he was also trying to define through his work.
That's right.
And
From
yeah,
category.
you actually get that sense even from, well, because I don't even know if this is totally correct, but it's what I thought about where when you were talking about Hegel, Doc, how we in free school operate on what Henry Winston said, like we seek knowledge from.
We drink from the wells of wisdom or knowledge wherever they are.
Yeah, there's like actually because there's this interview I wanted to pull from it to include in the compilation, but Harry Belafonte was interviewed in 1950 something by I guess this famous radio guy named Stud something.
Studs Terkel.
Yeah, and it's specifically an interview about jazz and music, basically how Belafonte understands music. And he says in a similar way to when you were talking about Hegel, Doc, where you were like, we read Hegel not from the category of we are Marxists, but from the category of people who from the category of the Black proletariat or the category of the Black freedom movement, which is the American revolutionary tradition. Where that's why we read Hegel, and we can see the pursuit of truth, that there's something valuable to take from that to apply to now. That like Harry Belafonte in this interview, he's basically being asked about why do you like folk music so much? And Harry Belafonte said straight up, he was like, well, I want to make a distinction that I'm not someone who is just re-singing folk music the way it's always been. He's basically saying that when I take from the world's folk music, what I'm doing is I'm injecting new meaning into it, that I'm able to see the truth in it and I'm able to inject new meaning to describe today. And that's kind of what he was even saying about the Irish resistance, where I feel like he was also saying, he was like, I take from the tradition, I take from the well of knowledge across the world to synthesize it for something that has a place, that because it's universal, it has a place today. And I bring new meaning into it. And I love the way he said new horizon, that that I'm never just sitting in the past. I'm never just sitting in the folk music of the past. by singing it, I make the argument that it has meaning. There's a universality because it comes from the people. There's a universality that can be seen today, that the Irish resistance has meaning for the Afro-American people. And by like performing it, we're injecting new meaning into it. And we're saying that it is a philosophy of the future, or it has something to do with the future, like the new horizon. Yeah, for some reason I kind of made that connection. And that's also why I think Harry Belafonte has a lot of depth as an intellectual
There's no question.
philosopher. And yeah, his life is full of pedagogy.
Can I just say something? See, this question of what is Marxism is very big, and most people who call themselves Marxist are more academics than they are Marxists. Marx had these 11 theses on this German philosopher named Ludwig Feuerbach. And the 11th one is probably the most famous, where he says, philosophers have interpreted the world in many ways. The point, however, is to change it.
Yeah.
And if Marxism becomes a different way of interpreting the world, you've lost the essence of it. The question is, if Marxism has any value, it must help or guide us or instruct us in how the world will be changed. But here is I'd say the problem. How do you make Marxism, this huge body of work, relevant to a people that you are a part of? In other words, let me put it this way. We can read everything that Marx and Engels ever wrote and still not be Marxist. Because the point of Marxism is to change the world. What made Lenin a Marxist? He utilized Marxism in the Russian context to change the world. What, you might say, is the task of Marxism in the United States? Well, it's not to do what most, quote, socialists and Marxists are doing, which is, chasing your tail. You never realize how to change the world. But to change America, you need this great tradition that Belafonte talks about. And like you say, his depth. I mean, one Harry Belafonte is worth more than 1,000 Marxists. I mean, it's so obvious. The truths of the world are not as complicated as most philosophers and most Marxists make them. It is because they want to keep, I think, intentionally or unintentionally, keep the world, quote, complicated and theoretical so as not to do anything or not to do anything significant. That's...
Philip Logan says, Marx as a philosopher is highly... Oh, wait, sorry. Were you going to go, Alice?
No, it's okay. You can go first. Yeah.
Okay. Philip Logan said, Marx as a philosopher is highly underrated and misunderstood. He's part of a tradition of Western political philosophy, but he also breaks with it. And then Danny Jacobs says, maybe we don't need Marxism then, like Marx-ism then.
I agree that Marx is underestimated by Marxists, really, but I agree with Danny. We don't need Marx as an ism. We need his body of work. I mean, so much we really do. It's a critical break, a paradigm shift, if you want to use that language. It is a way of using and understanding Hegel and, I think, Kant It is a way of doing social science, but it's not the end of the story.
Right.
And that's the thing. When it becomes an ism, it becomes a dogma and not a science. The scientific project, and we're going to talk about this more when we talk about string theory and quantum mechanics and relativity theory and all of that. Science progresses through syntheses. But when it comes to the United States, most Marxists will say there's nothing in the intellectual, philosophical, theoretical, or practical tradition of the American people that you want to synthesize with. And when you say that, you've already told me you have not read Du Bois or Robeson, and you don't know these traditions or don't care about them. Just one last thing. Last week we talked about neo-pragmatism and Cornel West's move towards neo-pragmatism, and Richard Rorty and others and so on and so forth, as they would see it, a plebeian or democratic philosophy, a philosophy coming organically from the people. And they're saying that to think in ways that are not this way, I was going to say something else, but to think in other ways is to move in unavoidably towards hierarchies and authoritarian thinking. You know what I'm saying? In other words, even to claim that we are struggling to know the world, to change it, or struggling to know the truth and change it. Truth itself, they would argue, is an anti-democratic category. To say there is a truth is authoritarian by nature. Well, now we got a problem. If there is no truth, the other point is there is no objective world. Yes. That the world is what you think it is. And it is your truth is as valuable as anybody else's truth. And people will make the claim that that is democratic. That is, and then you get this whole problem of democracy or people's democracy being equal to anarchism. Or another, just one last other thing. And the move to anarchism is a move away from the achievement of the power of the people or the power of the working class. Right. Because the truths of the ruling elite are the same as the truths of the revolutionary forces. In other words, Biden says that the truth is that Putin is an authoritarian and a war maker, and that China is a threat to the United States. Okay, that's the ruling elite. So suppose we say that's not true and an alternative. Well, they say that's his truth and that's your truth. You see what I'm saying? And there is no truth. There's no objective world. There is no measure of what is truth and what is not. And to call that democracy is a, how would you say, is such a distortion. I can't think of better words right now. And to then say, and that's where you get to identity politics. The truth is what my identity leads me to see as the truth. Another way to put it is that truth is an intersectional reality. So if I'm Black, woman, trans, poor, then my truth is what these intersecting identities leads me to. Now, just one other point. This is why the words of Harry Belafonte, like they resonate emotionally with us, but a lot of people, they don't resonate because they'll try to cancel Harry Belafonte by saying, well, that's his truth. He's a man. In the same way that a person like Audre Lorde tried to cancel Baldwin. Or rewind it, let's go back to Trotsky, who, the thing, he flirts with everything: anarchism, feminism, Black nationalism. And as long as it can be used to support his political ambitions. And, you talk about the article I wrote, which is okay, but, and this, I don't think it's unavoidable to me, to flirt with Trotskyism or Trotsky is to flirt with one of the great opportunists in the 20th century. He revises his own biography, to make it appear that he is a co-equal with Lenin in the Russian Revolution. I mean, that takes a lot of guts. You weren't even in the Bolshevik, in Lenin's party, but yet you're co-equal in this whole process. And so if that is your exemplar, what can you become except an opportunist? Or in your more, quote, mature variation, a representative of the forces of imperialism and war, of American imperialism, which a lot of them became.
I want to say that this conversation about the truth being undemocratic or anti-democratic reminded me of this Robeson documentary, which is bad. It's wrong. It's very wrong in many parts, especially on Robeson's stand on Stalin and the Soviet Union. But the parts that I'm thinking from there were these interviews that they did with Russian workers, which I literally had to hold my phone to Google Translate to even try and make sense of what they were saying. But what they were saying is, we love Paul Robeson because we are workers, and he fights for workers. And then you have people in India, they're writing tributes for Robeson saying we might be separated by thousands of miles, but your garden of flowers lies right next to mine. And if there was no truth, and if there wasn't something inherently um, connecting humanity all across the world, some basic fundamental truths and ideas, how does this happen then? That these Russian workers whose entire life worlds is so separated at that point, at that crucial Cold War moment from what was going on in America, how do they know and love Robeson like that? Yeah, I just wanted to add that.
The other thing that I thought of is, Doc, when you said that, what was it? You said that Belafonte looked to Du Bois and Robeson as class instructors rather than Black instructors. I think, that only.
See, yeah, he saw, yeah, I'm sorry.
No,
Go
sorry.
ahead. Yeah. Mhm.
The question that I asked was like, what does it mean to be a Black instructor, or what does it mean to be Black in this country? And because like in the free school, obviously we're not all Black, but we found something in people like King and Du Bois and Robeson and Belafonte. And it's because through the struggle in America, or the Afro-American struggle, it's been able to connect us to the world struggle. Like, it does say something to all of us where, King goes to India and sees the Indian freedom struggle. Robeson goes to the Soviet Union and calls it an experiment of the poor and working class and
Yeah.
leading society. And Du Bois says the same thing about China after liberation, where he's seeing like a society that has been changed. Working people are the four of that society. And that perfectly, these examples perfectly represent what Robeson essentially had said, and here I stand, which is that the black struggle is a human struggle. And I think that is the piece where, for us in the free school, it makes so much sense as you see the examples of these leaders and the organic connection. And what sometimes it is kind of jarring that it's not seen as something so obvious, and so clear through these examples and through history. And so the question is, what is it that's holding, what is instructing people? And what is keeping, why is Robeson or King or Du Bois not seen as revolutionary figures for this country?
Yeah, we have a few more comments. Daryl Wasteland Mitchell says, Marxism is the science of society according to what Engels stated. The science of society allows anyone to understand the general direction of the society in which one lives. One integrates all sciences, and they then become a material force when integrated into reality. Marxism, on the Black Hand side, has always been different from academic Marxism. And then Philip Logan also adds, Marx is definitely not the end of the story. And then he shares a heart emoji, keep it scientific. And then he says, identity politics on the left and right are in the long run idealism of subjectivized empiricism, subjectivized empiricism. Yeah. And yeah, something I was just thinking about is it's both that people like Du Bois give us new categories by which to think through what's happening in America and what's happening through the world, but also that the world itself and the people themselves have also transcended, I think, certain old categories. And yeah, I think that relates a lot to the Finkelstein conversation, but especially to the left in general.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think part of the way that I understand how we talk about the Black freedom struggle being a class struggle, but also giving to us a new understanding of how the class struggle unfolds is that it's one way of thinking about it is that America's history, it lends itself towards basically the field of class struggle and the avenues of class struggle being expanded much further beyond what just simply the European tradition of Marxism was able to conceptualize in terms of where the field and where the avenues and where the spheres of class struggle will unfold. And I feel yeah, I think it's something like the civil rights movement. If you're not able to see that as actually the class struggle unfolding, then you miss so many other things which are actually unfolding too in American society at this point. If you're not able to see something like the Black church as something which represents something not only for Black people, but also for the capacity of the working class in general in the United States, then you basically miss everything which is of potential in American history and in American society in the present moment, looking towards the future. Yeah.
Well, there's so much that we still have to work out. And and we, I'm like you all. Why can't more people see this? Why can they not see? No class or nation in the modern world has seized power except with the political program that in seizing power, we will institute a new democracy, a democracy for the people. That's why on October 1st, 1949, in Tiananmen Square, Mao Zedong said, "We declare the People's Republic of China." Republic and people, a new democracy. And we will build a new democracy and an economy that is democratic and meets the needs of the people. So there is no revolutionary struggle, which is not the struggle for democracy. You cannot win people unless you have a program that insists that the regime that is anti-democratic, and this regime is, that is anti-peace and anti the American people, we revolutionaries must make the argument that a different democracy is possible. You have a lot of leftists, Maoists, neo-Maoists, Trotskyists, neo-Trotskyists, that would make the argument that they are complete revolutionaries. How do they put it? That they want to go directly to revolution. That let's stop all this talk, they would say, of democracy.
Right.
If you listen, you'll hear it. We are more revolutionary because our path is directly to seize power in the name of socialism. Well, it's never happened before. And I think with the political and intellectual capacity of the people here making those arguments, it ain't going to happen here. No way. You win people by making the claim against the ruling elite that it is robbing the people of democracy of their rights, well, which it is doing. And the good thing right now is the majority of American people agree with that. They don't yet see the alternative and how we get to that, but they see that this is a ruling class that is robbing them of their rights, robbing them of their life, robbing their children of all possible, the whole nine. And now if a recession hits in the face of all of this inflation, who knows what's going to happen. But who represents this? Take Martin Luther King. I always try to make the argument. People get it completely wrong about nonviolence. Nonviolence is the alternative to the violent, or what we often call civil war path to democracy or the seizure of power. What King was saying is that is not a possibility, a realistic possibility in the United States. The path to democracy must be a path that does not divide the people between and amongst themselves, but separates the people from the forces who are attempting to hold the democratic afflorescence back. Let me give you one example. If King felt otherwise, he could have stopped when the Civil Rights Acts were passed in 1964 and 1965.
Right.
He said that was just the shell of democracy. The substance of democracy was in the achievement of economic democracy. So some people say, well, he didn't say socialism. Well, Neither did Lenin. Mao didn't say socialism. But if it is an economy where the state takes over corporations that are not prepared to find a redistribution of wealth and serve the people, then so be it. But economic democracy follows upon legal rights. And so the civil rights movement becomes a wider, human rights struggle, and all people struggle. I don't know if I'm making myself clear enough, but anything else is to create confusion, especially among young people. And I agree with you, Emily. Their audience are young people who are inexperienced,
Right.
who don't know anything. You know, they're people who proclaim Trotskyism and how brilliant Trotsky was, and they don't know a damn thing about the Black freedom movement. Not a thing. So how do you know that Trotsky is brilliant and useful to the situation when you don't even know the most current history of your own country? You have no grounds to test the hypothesis that you're making about Trotsky. And it is a mere hypothesis. It is a belief more, not even a hypothesis, it's a belief more than anything else. That Trotsky is this great leader. He was not. But let's say he was, for the sake of argument. On what are the empirical basis for your claim that his theories would apply to the struggle for democracy in the United States, and you don't even know that history? I mean, we could talk on and on and on. It is, yeah, you know.
Yeah, it reminds me of the person that you referenced last week, Peter Voigt, in his discussion of string theory, where he's like, string theory is not even a theory. Like, it's not even wrong. Like, it's not even a theory that you can really test. Like, it's just something that people are into, and like it has like a mathematical, I guess, logic to it, but it's not like an actual theory of reality that you can test. And for decades, the physicists who were string theorists were like basically trying to convince people, like the public essentially, that this was like an actual theory of reality rather than just something that was like cool that they were thinking about.
Yeah, what he was saying is, I think, and I agree with you, Jerry, what I'm trying to say, it's not even falsifiable. You can't even falsify it because there are no empirical conditions to it. You know, it's a whole grand theory of revolution where it can't be empirically tested or empirically falsified. And hence it becomes more like a dogma. I won't even say a religion. Religion has more empirical foundations than a lot of this does. So I agree. It's and what is, I like the way he put it about string theory. You know, string theory has been around for a little almost 40 years with no results. You know, unless you're, want to deal with, complex mathematical equations. You say, hey, yada, yada, yada. But and so much of what goes for left thinking is not even falsifiable. It's not even, put it another way, a testable hypothesis. It is more in keeping with the logic, syllogistic logic. Abstraction upon abstraction upon abstraction, and then let's go out to a protest. Okay, I'm with you going out to the protest. But then to make sense of the protests and the multiple protests and anger and so on, you have to have what we could call a general theory, a way of explaining, of connecting these things. But if there is no empirical reference, then, like Voigt said, it's not even falsifiable. Here he's using Karl Popper's thing that to make a theory more than being verifiable has to be falsifiable. In other words, there has to be a credible alternative to it. But if it's not even capable of eliciting a credible alternative, it's then not even falsifiable, which is another way of saying it's not even worth taking seriously.
I want to add to that just briefly is that the thing that Jeremiah was saying and you're saying, Doc, the thing I really liked about how Peter Voigt puts it is he brings it to a question of what do you say to the people? I think this is what Jeremiah was saying also. He's saying the least you can do is admit to the people that this is not a theory of anything. And you owe that to the people because you're scientists, but you've forgotten that ultimately your allegiance should be to the people. You're doing this work to further human knowledge, not just your knowledge or your, like, cool mathematical whatever formulations that you want to make. Okay, it's interesting. You're coming up with interesting things, but what will you say to the people? And then, this is the same thing with the left organizations because, you have all these theoretical formulations, but what will you say to the people who are struggling today? Will you go and talk to them about neo-Stalinism and this and that, or but then Du Bois has an answer. Du Bois studied the people. He wrote a Philadelphia Negro. Yeah.
Yeah, but see, this I guess Peter Voigt is saying something even more devastating. A theory that is string theory that claims to be a unified theory of everything turns out to be a theory of nothing. And it happens. And what Voigt also says, it is that string theory has been a monumental setback to theoretical physics. And he says this has never happened in the modern history of science. Such a setback. I would make the claim that we could almost analogize it not only to identity politics, but a lot of the left theorizing, which claims that it is coming up with a theory, maybe not of everything, but of a lot of things, and it turns out to be a theory of nothing. A great irony. I mean, it's really something when you think about it. I guess it's after 2:00, and my colleague and friend Serafina has to go to work. And suppose if Emily, is it all right if we perhaps conclude, and we will resume with Hegel next time, but now informed and deepened by our discussion of Harry Belafonte and Robeson.
Yes. Well, thank you to everyone who was in the comments today and part of our tribute, our humble tribute to Harry Belafonte. We're looking forward to paying more of a tribute to him at our June Intercivilizational Festival, which is officially dedicated to Paul Robeson and the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad's 125th birthdays. But we are hoping to have an art exhibit at the event that we want to, now that we've discovered so much about Harry Belafonte, we want to, and with his passing, we want to dedicate the exhibit to him. But thank you to everyone who participated. And of course, thank you to everyone on the screen. I love you all a lot. And we'll see you all next week for Hegel. Bye.